Oh my god.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to ArtiFact number 27. I am joined by Joel Parrish, and we will be discussing two books today, actually. We have Thomas Pynchon's cult classic, Gravity's Rainbow, and we have Kurt Vonnegut's cult classic, Slaughterhouse-Five. They both actually tackle some similar themes, similar idea, right? Where both books, of course, take place during World War II. There's this, I guess Vonnegut has a bit more of a bit more of a kind of a almost like a Mark Twain moralizing strain, although he handles it very well. Gravity's Rainbow even just kind of has like not even that, but they're interesting to talk about together because I mean I'd say both are probably in this kind of like postmodern category, right? Like when people think of like postmodern writing, you could have like totally formless stuff, right? Like Thomas Pynchon. I mean, we're not going to hide that we're not fans of this book. David Foster Wallace, but Kurt Vonnegut is also a postmodernist writer, right?
Mm-hmm.
If people sometimes look at my channel or some of the stuff that maybe Dan Schneider of cosmoetica.com writes, they might think like you're being very unfair, right? There's so many books and techniques that could be used from postmodernism. It's not all bad, and I mean this is true, right? I think when you look at something like Slaughterhouse-Five, you see everything from the plot is not linear, right? It keeps jumping literally through time,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's tons of humor, right? Which is what Pomo sort of like tries to be, right? And it's kind of like destabilizing aesthetic, right? Humor, ought to be part of this. I think it's a very useful toolkit. But writers of varying talents are going to handle this differently, right? I think more than anything, like some of the stuff that I've been talking about in the last few shows about, guys, like don't get caught up on aesthetics, right? You have to think about art as art, right? Think about artistic success versus like aesthetics and stylistics. And this is a perfect example, right? One book it has one set of aesthetics, another one has a very similar one, but only one of them I think is very successful, which is Slaughterhouse-Five.
Right.
I mean let's I guess like jump into it. We're going to start with Gravity's Rainbow. I very much resent having to have read this book. I was rereading bits of it also this morning, just before the show started, just to sort of jog my memory, which is kind of alarming, right? I read this book recently. I should not have to jog my memory, right? I did not have to jog my memory of Slaughterhouse-Five, but I did have to jog my memory of Gravity's Rainbow this morning. And I got very sleepy, right? Which is another problem, right? I wanted to be excited for the show, but I'm feeling awfully sleepy after going through it again this morning. So hopefully we could make it through a few hours without any problems. But okay, I mean, okay, Gravity's Rainbow.
Yes.
What like I guess immediate impressions, Joe? Like what is the book like? Were you also feeling that it was just a complete drudge, right? Like I just abandoned it halfway and started doing Slaughterhouse-Five. Then I came back to it because I was like, let me give myself the treat first, right? I just can't
Yeah.
deal with this right away.
Yeah. Well, thanks for passing it over to me. So I have a couple things to say as a matter of introduction. First, in a strange roundabout way, I have to give Gravity's Rainbow a little bit of credit for helping me gain more of a foothold of a true interest in the arts and in writing in particular. And the reason for that is because years ago, this has probably been 7 or 8 years ago now, when I first discovered Dan Schneider's Cosmoetica, I ended up on his site as there was another author who had written a guest essay for the site, this gentleman named Briggs Seekins, and his article was lambasting MFA writing mills, basically, and he had talked about the downfalls of I think he had wanted to attend one or did attend one, I can't remember, but anyway, I ended up on Cosmoetica. I started just looking through the various links of what essays were there on the right hand column of the site. And I forget the exact title of the essay, but I saw the Gravity's Rainbow essay that Dan had written, and I had not read the book, but I certainly, this was fairly fresh out of college. I was still in my early to mid 20s when I came across Cosmoetica, so I definitely had heard of the book, and I think I had had a couple of friends who, through maybe college literature classes or something, had read the book and talked about how much they liked it or how good it was, how difficult it was, these kind of things. And then I read Dan's review just to get a further flavor for Cosmoetica and some of his takes and his writing style. And it was very refreshing that someone just came out and said exactly what they thought about this book. They thought it was awful. Here are the reasons why. It's a really long essay. And it's, it was kind of shocking to me in a way, right? That there's somebody out there willing to just call it exactly like they saw it when it came to, by now, a fairly well canonized book, maybe one of the, the Mount Rushmore books in the Pomo sphere, postmodernist writing. So that led me on then to continue just kind of mining through Cosmoetica and finding more and more helpful pieces there and insightful things. And so obviously, eventually that leads us to now, right? You and I connected eventually. I've connected with Dan and Jessica and some other people from the site and everything else. So I am grateful to Gravity's Rainbow in a strange way from all of that. But I had just put off tackling the book because there are so many other good books out there to read. And, after many, many years of now enjoying those and going through it, you proposed reading Gravity's Rainbow for this show and doing a compare contrast with Slaughterhouse-Five, which I think this was my third or fourth time reading. And so I went along with that. I said, all right, fine, I'll go buy this book and read it. So you and I have been obviously communicating along the way with this, and I went to my local bookstore and ended up buying a new copy of this. It's the same edition that you have. And I got about 20 pages into it and knew that I would be returning it to get my money back. Just really, really disliked it from the jump. Was pretty amazed at how much of a drag it is. I think I texted you on more than one occasion saying I can read, if I read this book in the evenings after a day of work and after dinner, which is, I read a lot, at that time. If I read this book and get through about 10 pages of it, I have cured any insomnia I might have had for the day, right? It essentially put me right to sleep. I literally fell asleep on the couch.
I had to stop reading it at night. I started I literally redid my schedule to read it in the mornings. Right. Yeah. And then do my other work at night, because it's you just can't, I'd be and my wife would be like, fuck, you're stuck on page 60. You keep falling asleep day after day. Off. Are you sure you want to do the show? And I was like, let me just read this in the mornings. I can't do it any other way. So I know that feeling.
Yeah, exactly. So we agree on that. So I mean, that's certainly an indictment of the book and how it fails in numerous respects. The bottom line is, just to summarize my opening comments here. I texted you at one point and I said, I don't know that I'm going to make it through this book before the show. Let's read, or I will read, the first 215 pages of this novel. And Slaughterhouse-Five, in the edition that both of us have, I believe, is about 215 pages. And so I said, let's just go toe to toe over that exact same span of time. And the pages are also smaller in Vonnegut's book, with a lot, more space between, so really it's an even shorter book than the 215 of his pages compared to 215 of Pynchon's pages. So let's compare what these two books aim to accomplish and what they actually do accomplish in the same page count. And I think the difference could hardly be more stark. I put in my show notes to you that reading Gravity's Rainbow is like wading through a neck-high bog, probably in the summertime with mosquitoes attacking your face. Whereas reading Slaughterhouse-Five afterward, which I didn't do what you did. I read as much of Gravity's as I could take and then still return it within the 30-day window to get my money back. But then, reading Slaughterhouse afterward was like a nice bike ride down a fresh wooded
Hmm.
summer lane. It breezes by. It's very entertaining while also being, I'd say at the same time, just as sketchy, if not almost more sketchy in certain ways as Gravity's Rainbow, but much richer and more dense with the way that it takes on its characters, the way it takes on the architecture of the plot. There's a bit of a plot to Slaughterhouse, but it's more about the narrative drive of the book, and so yeah, not looking forward anytime soon to picking Gravity's Rainbow back up and trying to finish the book.
Hmm.
It's one of those things where I don't know what I'm going to see that's going to be any better. You'll maybe give us more insight into that because you did eventually finish it, but that 215 pages gets you through part one and a little bit into part two, which has a different, slightly different flavor and way that it goes about the writing, but it's really just so poor from the way too many characters and their bad characterization, um, on and on. And I think the final thing that you could say is an indictment of the book, and then I'll pass it back to you, is Gravity's Rainbow was published several years after Slaughterhouse-Five. Slaughterhouse-Five was from the late 1960s. Gravity's Rainbow, I think, was 1973,
Hmm.
74, something like that. So both of these novels were also written, they're written pretty close to one another in the same window. But when you think that the one did still precede the other, who knows if Pynchon read Slaughterhouse-Five? I almost have to imagine he would have, before working on his own book, or maybe he had been working on Gravities for a long time already, and then didn't finish it till a few years later. But no matter how you slice it, it's just so overloaded and overlarded. It's his takes on things have not made it past like a teenage level.
Hmm.
Anything he thinks is funny is like something you might have guffawed at when you were a kid, slugging back Mountain Dews and playing video games with your friends as a
Hmm.
teenager. I mean, his attempts at humor fall very flat. Vonnegut's almost always sore, and so hopefully that'll become evident to people as we go through this. But I think talking about a masterpiece versus just something to return to the bookstore after you buy it. So
Yeah, and the reason why I read the entirety of the book, right? Originally we are like, all right, let's do this 200 page toe to toe. Let's see what happens page by page. Let's see what is accomplished over the identical spans of time, right, and space. The reason why I decided to do the whole thing is because the way that Pynchon fanboys are. Like they will immediately jump into like, huh, you didn't read the whole book, huh? So you're gonna
sure.
miss, and then they will throw at you like 1,000 little like pointless, like worthlessly constructed details that are
Hmm.
supposed to somehow revamp the entire structure. They're supposed to
Right.
prop everything up, right? And basically it's like, all right, so if Joe's going to concentrate in the first 200, I will back him up and say that as the book goes on, it
Yeah.
doesn't get any better. The edifice continues to collapse, right? There's nothing really there to prop it up, right? And even if some of the ideas are good, which I'll get to a little bit later, such as in the ending, this is I think what people don't get. You could have great ideas, but if you don't have the execution, I mean, who cares, right?
Hmm.
There's a reason why, like when in my own personal reading, like in philosophy, I always return to Nietzsche, right? And I am far less compliant when it comes to like reading other philosophers, because even if the ideas are good, even if I could get something out of it, if it's great writing, as with Nietzsche, that already is this edifice that you could build off of in a richer way, right? Because you not only have the great ideas, right, you also have the ways that they're structured, right, and you have ideas for the ways that you yourself could structure things. And as an artist, right, this is what you really should be looking at, right? We're also going to look at some of the little kind of like guides that are available, and the fact that they're like the things that they choose to focus on are really kind of telling, right? It really reveals how little they think about art as art, right, and how much they're missing along the way, right?
Hmm.
With these kinds of like pointless, like geeky sort of obsessions and fixations, right? So I guess like we're gonna jump like back and forth between both books a little bit, and I wanted to start with just like the opening, right? Because the opening. So first we have this epigraph, right? One
Yeah.
beyond the zero, and it says, "Nature does not know extinction; all it knows is transformation. Everything science has taught me and continues to teach me strengthens my belief in the continuity of our spiritual existence after death." As the text goes on, you realize that this is referring to there's a few characters, right? But Slothrop is I'd say the protagonist,
Hmm.
and eventually you learn that Slothrop had like a bunch of like experiments done to him as a child, or rather as an infant, where there is like some kind of like stimulus that he was given that created like boners, right, for him.
Yeah.
And now whenever he has sex, these German V2 rockets are the site that he has sex in, the rockets, like they fall like in that similar place, right? And eventually he
Yeah.
recognizes this and he decides to sort of figure out what's going on, why this is, what is this mystery of this like new like supersonic V2 called like rocket 00000.
Yep.
And so like this epigraph is supposed to be a reference to this. And here's the thing, like in Dan Schneider's essay, I'm going to link to it in the show notes if you guys want to read it. But basically in Dan's essay, he says that the epigraph has, kind of like very little to do with the text. I disagree. I think it does have something to do with the text, but what I would say is it refers to something that is just completely pointless. I mean, like what exactly like what exactly is the purpose and what exactly is the idea behind, here's this guy, whenever he has sex, there's a V2 rocket. We know there's these experiments that were done on him, and then later on it's revealed that maybe no experiments were done on him. What
Hmm.
exactly is the purpose? Like there's nothing really compelling about that. And to the extent that you could derive any kind of metaphorical content from this, uh, it doesn't matter that you have to adjudicate what that metaphor is and whether it's effective. If you're going to essentially say that V2 rockets are big penises, in the sky, right? Oh my God, look at, patriarchal men doing the things that patriarchal men have done since time immemorial. Now, since we have the formation of rockets, it's the most kind of dramatic version of this. They are destroying the world with their, huge egos and penises. I mean, it's just it's very, very like these are things that have been tackled for a very long time, right? You
Right.
have you have this kind of symbolism, going back to the Greeks, going back to ancient Chinese poetry, right? Like this is like going on forever. And the fact that this becomes like the controlling metaphor for the text, that should immediately alarm you. Like this cannot possibly go in a proper direction unless it's like completely subverted in some way, right?
Right.
And then also like there's this other part, right, where this like 0000 rocket has like this, in German it's called like a black box, right? And it's like like what is that, like the vagina? And eventually like
Yeah.
the guy that gets put into the rocket, right, Gottfried, um he's then revealed to be like, no, the black box is actually him, he's the black box, right? And it's like it's all these like like topsy-turvy, like like twists and turns that
Yeah.
really it's just like, okay, so like when you discover this new thing, right, okay, now what's the point? You discover this next thing, okay, what's the point, right? It's not enough to merely have a twist and turn, twist and turn, twist and turn. They have to go somewhere. And the crazy part about it is like I can imagine, so like most of the Thomas Pynchon fans, like especially like big fans of this book, they're probably the type of people that absolutely hate, like, oh, I hate, Hollywood action films, right? It's all plot, it's all action, there's nothing really to attach to. But the fact that this book needs so many like fan synopses and summaries which often themselves are contradictory from one another, and
Hmm.
oftentimes like even don't make sense like in and of themselves, that is like a kind of de facto, like action film, right? That is Hollywood schlock, right? That means the book has to be absolutely plot driven, because you're essentially saying all you have left here are the machinations, right?
Yeah.
And if you're forcing someone to sit down and really like go through all the machinations to really understand them, and if you don't understand them, that means that you're really missing the what the book is about, and therefore you shouldn't even opine on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not even sure to what extent this is even true, because if you guys Google like Cosmoetica, Gravity's Rainbow, Reddit, right, you're gonna find like a Reddit thread making fun of Dan's review of Gravity's Rainbow in the Thomas Pynchon subreddit,
Mm-hmm.
and it's full of like all these comments like, oh, this guy's so wrong about this, but I'm not even gonna bother explaining why, right? And
Yeah,
the
he
thing
just
is,
much doesn't get it. Yeah.
yeah, and all the comments are like that. And the thing is, I know the way that these fans operate. If they in fact themselves understood all the machinations in the book that they think that they do, or they claim that they do, or that they want to, they'd be able to actually go through Dan's essay. And there were like, I think, some portions of Dan's essay that in terms of these machinations, like Dan like missed something. Like I think, for example, like at some point he thinks like the Dutch agent Katya like just like appears in the like sanitarium and then just like disappears for good. I'm not sure exactly what he said, but the what he wrote, it sort of made it seem like that's where he was going with it. In fact, like Katya appears like many times throughout later in the text. And they could have easily like been like, oh, look, Dan is missing this critical point of the plot, but they themselves don't even know enough of these like so-called important features to be able to make that critique, right? So like it's all this like all it's like such an elaborate fraud, right?
Yeah.
And the defenders, right? And also like there's this other, so like Keith Jackowicz, who I sometimes do these shows with, he also did this review, negative review of Gravity's Rainbow. And I remember like some people were commenting on it, and like some guy was like, your problem is you're not like, you don't understand that this book is a farce and you're taking it too seriously. It's like, essentially like,
Yeah.
oh, like don't even bother doing this, elaborate critique of the book. Don't even bother trying to understand what it's about. Don't even bother trying to be detailed, because it's a farce, because I said so, it's a farce. Therefore, we're going to excuse everything about it, right? That's so like you're trying to like, essentially, defang any possibility of critique before the critique even begins, right? By making those kinds of statements. And at the same time, you think that you are protecting Thomas Pynchon from these critiques, when in fact, like you're the one that's being the rudest person of all, right? You're saying
Yeah.
it's a farce and not even worth this kind of analysis, right? And just kind of like, it makes you wonder, like, well, what great work of art could you ever say that about, right? I feel like that is like the most offensive thing that you could do, right, to a work of art, especially if you believe that it's great, right? To like
Yeah.
essentially dismiss it in that way and say it's beyond critique simply because you don't like what someone is saying, right? So the kinds of like behaviors of the fans is it's really something, right, to witness online.
It is.
um
Yeah. And some of the people in that subreddit, they'll even openly admit that they don't get the book, or they don't like the book, or they couldn't finish the book, or I've wanted to reread it a second time, or you have to read it 3 or 4 or 5 times,
mhm.
to even get it. Whereas obviously with good or great works of art, you want to go back and reread, because there's more to it. There's more to
Mhm.
discover that you would have missed simply because it's done well. In this case, it's such a mess that I mean, nobody could focus on this book, I don't think, for any extended period of time. Your brain checks out. It's just the equivalent of putting your head in a microwave for a while, and I mean, everything just gets frazzled, and it's so inconsistent. I said this to you in my notes. It's inconsistent across the whole thing, but page to page, line to line, paragraph to paragraph. I mean, he can have some decent passages, and then it goes nowhere or fizzles out, or he's back to the nonsensical rambling writing style again, and so on. And I think that you made the point already that I was definitely going to jump in on and just say there's this book by the fan base is hermetically sealed and protected with the all encompassing. You either simply don't get it, or it was all meant to be slapstick and a farce to begin with, and to lampoon all of society or the writing of books itself. It's anything you want to make up, and that's the problem, is you can map almost anything onto this, because you can't map really anything at all. So it's therefore it's just open for whatever you want it to be. And people will defend it tooth and nail, but a lot of the time, to your point, I mean, either they'll make a few sentences of inroads on trying to defend it, and they'll contradict themselves or admit that they don't really have any legs to stand on, or it'll just be the whole bro doesn't get it, obviously bro just doesn't get it, and then there's absolutely no response, right?
Yeah.
I mean, nobody in that whole thread takes on even a few paragraphs worth of really trying to answer the criticisms that Dan levies, and it's just clear that nobody's willing to put the effort in to do that, and probably deep down knowing if they tried to, it's a lost cause. So it's really just so unpleasurable to read, is the bottom line. It's really just no fun at all. So if you want to start actually reading some passages here.
So like in the first page, right, the opening paragraph. So first of all, right, the book has right, like the subsections are that you have these like little squares. And this is a newer edition, obviously, but in the older edition, I think the squares were like colored in or something, and you have like all these like analyses from people that are like, oh, like these squares, they look like microfilm, right? This book is like a movie, and there's like a lot of analysis paid to like literally what is like supposed to be, these are just breaks, right? These are fucking breaks in between sections. They're supposed to denote the passage of time, the kind of like, you sort of, get themes together before you move on to something else. This is how it works, right? The idea that, these are like little symbols. I mean, like, like we could talk about like the fact that Kurt Vonnegut in his novels, like he has illustrations, right? But we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on the illustrations, right? Because like it's humor, it's like a nice little offset, but that's not really what the book is about. I feel like there's been more analysis done of these like squares and what they might mean than actual illustrations, right? In Vonnegut's novels, right? Which is which is just kind of crazy. But anyway, this is how the first chapter begins. A screaming comes across the sky that has happened before, but there is nothing to compare it to now. And when I first read this, I was like, all right, this is probably a reference to, knowing that this book is about the V2 rockets. This is probably a reference to like the launch of a V2 rocket or something like that. And out of curiosity, I was just like looking at different, there's a Wikipedia, or rather there's a wiki, right, for Gravity's Rainbow, not Wikipedia, but, the wiki kind of like, system. So there's the Gravity's Rainbow wiki, or gravitiesrainbow.pynchonwiki.com. And so in this kind of like, it's supposed to be like a blow by blow sort of analysis of what happening page by page. And so they are isolating. A screaming comes across the sky, and this is how they describe it. These opening words are forever linked with the V2 rocket. They may bring associations with bombs whistling as they fall, or with the high whine of post-war jet engines. But they are not, and this is boldface, they are not a description of the sound actually made in target zones by the V2 rocket, which was typically the sharp cracking explosion of the 750 kilogram warhead, followed by a deeper, more or less extended sonic boom. So they feel that it's necessary to make this distinction here, right? That this is, probably not the sound of the rocket itself. It's probably a sound of sirens or something like that. And what they miss, of course, right, in thinking that this is like some sort of like salient distinction is this like an example of good writing? I mean, when let's imagine for a second that they're wrong, that this is in fact a screaming rocket. we've heard this kind of phrasing forever, right?
Yeah.
Screaming rockets, right? This kind of like anthropomorphism of everything from like birds to rockets, right? It's very, very common. The fact that this would be like the first line in what is supposed to be like a great American novel, again, if you're attuned to the arts and you're attuned to writing, this should alarm you at least a little bit. And even if it's not a rocket, right? Because these fans are very, very sort of emphatic that it's not, it's, let's say, sirens. That doesn't change the analysis at all, right? A screaming siren, that is also trite, right? It's not really, it's not a good opening sentence, right? You want an opening sentence to hook. You want an opening sentence to be memorable in some other way. You want an opening sentence to, do something other than what's happening here, right?
Yeah, even if it was human screaming or animal screaming, right? If it's literal screaming.
Yeah.
Okay. So people, in war, people are terrified and they scream, I mean, again, there's just nothing particularly to draw you in on that. It's pretty plain. And I mean, obviously we'll get to it later, but I told you in my notes, it's really interesting even to compare, he uses the verb screaming in this first line of the book. It's not particularly well executed or insightful or interesting. And Vonnegut uses the verb screaming in a very humorous way in one of the scenes fairly early on in his book that I'll quote from later. So already, Vonnegut 1, Pynchon 0.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned a human screaming, because there was another analysis that would say like this might be referring to V2 rockets, this might be referring to sirens, or perhaps they say perhaps more poetically referring to the terror of the people in the city. So, and they call it poetically, right? And it's like it's the opposite. It's prosaic. It's not poetic. It's prosaic. But just like they need to like force something into it, right? So they turn something that is clearly prosaic into something that it's not, right? So anyway, to go on, it is too late. The evacuation still proceeds, but it's all theater. There are no lights inside the cars, no light anywhere. Above him, lift girders old as an iron queen, and glass somewhere far above that would let the light of day through. Again, like we have like another cliche, second paragraph, right? We have like, the light of day. And that's not, it's, that could be like a little bit sort of, idiomatic. But in the context specifically of like war and darkness and this, alternating light and darkness, to force like this light of day, into this context, right? That is going to be a naked cliche, right? It's much harder to sort of say that it's being subverted in any way, given the context. But it's night. He's afraid of the way the glass will fall. Soon it will be a spectacle, the fall of a crystal palace. But coming down in total blackout without one glint of light, only great invisible crashing. And I think that's a little bit better, right? Like that's like more decent. And that's the thing, like, given that it's so like, there's so many modifiers, there's so much over description, it stands to reason that if you have a book that's, almost 800 pages and it's over modified and there's too much description and too much of this, too much of that, you're going to chance upon decent writing. You're even going to chance upon some good writing, some good phrasings. I think there are some good phrasings and some good writing in the text, but in the context of 800 pages where most of it is not like that, that this is just like a process of randomness, right? Yeah. I could feed, text into an AI and get a whole lot of garbage back. And every once in a while, you're going to get an interesting line. Every once in a while, you're going to get an interesting phrase. Every once in a while, you're going to get an interesting juxtaposition. But that's not, that's not, to say anything deeper than that. So anyway, this turns into this thing where this is either a fantasy or a dream of some sort. Eventually, this character like ends up kind of like, like breaking a fall in like a bunk bed or something. So he's kind of like, moving like seamlessly between, a dream and wakefulness, again, like adopting like a lot of, what we might call like pomo techniques, right? Sometimes throughout the text, you don't know if it's a fantasy, you don't know if it's reality. Other times, things that are fantasies turn out to be real. Things that are said explicitly to be real turn out to be fantasies, back and forth. Um, but here we get like to this next paragraph, like after this fantasy evacuation, right before these V2 launches. Um, I'm going to read this whole paragraph, and I'm just going to like explain afterwards why this kind of writing, right, whether it's to a lesser extent done by people like George Eliot, right, who wrote Middlemarch, or here, right, much later, why in either of these cases, like these kinds of things don't really work. So this is the paragraph. Speaking of the evacuees, they have begun to move. They pass in line out of the main station, out of downtown, and begin pushing into older and more desolate parts of the city. Is this the way out? Faces turn to the windows, but no one dares ask, not out loud. Rain comes down. No, this is not disentanglement from, but a progressive nodding into. They go into under archways, secret entrances of rotted concrete that only looked like loops of an underpass. Certain trestles of blackened wood have moved slowly by overhead, and the smells begun of coal from days far to the past, smells of naphtha winters, of Sundays when no traffic came through, of the coral-like and mysteriously vital growth around the blind curves and out the lonely spurs, a sour smell of rolling stock absence of maturing rust developing through those emptying days, brilliant and deep, especially at dawn, with blue shadows to seal its passage, to try to bring events to absolute zero. And it is poorer the deeper they go, ruinous secret cities of poor places whose names he has never heard. The walls break, the roofs get fewer, and so do the chances for light. The road, which ought to be opening into a broader highway, instead has been getting narrower, more broken, cornering tighter and tighter until all at once, much too soon, they are under the final arch. Brakes grab and spring terribly. It is a judgment from which there is no appeal, right? So with a paragraph like this, and you see this kind of thing all the time, when you stuff so much into a paragraph in terms of just like pure description, and it's like just like all kinds of like terms that don't like easily belong with one another, or adjectives that are like way too plentiful. The idea that authors that are like not in control of their craft, what they think they're doing is they're like, you know what, I'm gonna really really like master this craft. I'm going to try to have like the most perfect descriptions. I'm going to have so many of them. I'm going to really like overwhelm the senses. And they think this is in fact what's happening. But what really is happening is you're overwhelming the senses only in as far as you are trying to make the brain process things in a way that the brain simply does not process. The arts are processed by the brain, but the brain is not very good at getting a heap of like nothingness, right? These like, and the descriptions themselves are very kind of like pale, right? Like the individual descriptions, they don't really stick in your mind in any way. They're not really there. Like I would challenge like anyone to read this paragraph, go away somewhere, do something for an hour, and then try to remember even like 2 or 3 details from it, right? Mm-hmm. Most people wouldn't come up with anything because there's really nothing for the brain to latch onto. And authors sometimes think like, oh, I'm doing something that's very difficult, but really the really really difficult thing is knowing exactly what to put in and what to leave out. You could easily put in whatever the fuck you want in a paragraph. You can make a paragraph 10 pages long, all kinds of random little things, all kinds of random little descriptions. That's not the hard part. The hard part is knowing what the brain will process, what will be memorable, and what works, not only in the context of this passage, but in the context of, you're always thinking of a comparison to prior books, right? Or books that you might imagine coming in the future. Right. And instead, like this just becomes this kind of like mush. Right. And I mentioned George Eliot previously, like, much better writer overall, but still like, tons of paragraphs where you have like just a lot of just over description that, after reading like a 2-page paragraph in Middlemarch, you kind of like, you don't even remember like what happened and why it was there. Right. So the paragraphs more or less kind of like, go in this fashion, right? And ultimately,
that's a good paragraph. by Pynchon standards.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's better than many. Exactly. Yeah.
That's actually a pretty good paragraph. Just to give people a flavor for the book. I mean, it's somewhat coherent. You do at least you're able to kind of follow what's going on and form some sense of a picture. Okay, so it's a group of people leaving a bombed out, dilapidated, grizzled, rain-soaked city. Got it. I mean, at least we know that. But it takes 4 times longer than it should. And that's about as pleasurable as the book gets.
Yeah. And later on, like you get this as it goes on, like I would read analyses of like, oh yeah, the famous banana breakfast. Like it's like some like it's some sort of like, wonderful set of descriptions, or like like that it's doing something. It's like, all right, so there's a they're in a fucking war zone. There's like a rooftop garden. They're growing bananas there, and maybe they don't have access to other food, so they keep like, they make like banana stews, they make banana sandwiches, they eat bananas whole, like but there's no description there that sticks with you. And in fact, like when they do try, like when Pynchon does try to like become poetic when it comes to the bananas, like this we come up with. So this is in the second section. Pirate goes to the phone and rings up Stanmore after all, has to go through the usual long routine, but knows he's already stopped believing in the rocket he saw. God has plucked it for him out of its airless sky like a steel banana. What kind of description is that? Like it's like I look, granted, I will say that it is rather novel to say, you know what, in describing a rocket, I'm going to compare it to a steel banana in the sky. But merely because it's like, a weird and over the top, it doesn't make it good, right? There's no there's other than like purely like a shape, right? And also like later on, like, so okay, we have the rocket penis connection, right? We have the rocket banana connection, and then later on, there's all these like, homosexual style jokes about penises and bananas. Like this is where we're essentially going, right, with all this. Right. And then as he's like eating bananas, right, there's a lot of like, sort of like homoerotic stuff, which is also another funny thing. Like, I bet you that a lot of the people that are into this book, they are probably like very kind of, conventionally liberal. Right. They're probably, educated, in like, colleges. Right. And they, they have like all the correct opinions, as it were. But there's a lot of stuff here that is just like flat out, just like, making fun of gay people, making fun of like homosexual acts. And this is like supposed to be the humor, right? And at some point, like I remember like in Dan's essay, when he mentioned the Byron the light bulb scene where eventually this like anthropomorphic light bulb gets like screwed into some like homosexual's ass, right? And that's supposed to be like a joke, like haha. Out of curiosity, like, so like I wanted to read that scene, and I was like, so I had this like PDF open of the text, and I just hit Control F to search for Byron, and I was like, all right, this is probably like like maybe like a half a page or a page long of like a joke or whatever. And it said Byron appears 147 times or something. And I was like, what the fuck? Like, and then just reading it, it was at least like 10, 20 pages of this thing. Right. This is supposed to be plenty. It was going on for like 20 pages. It appears on like 147 times the word Byron, and then like never again. So like basically this is sort of like how it starts, right? We have we have a guy that's sort of having this like fever dream perhaps of an evacuation. Stream comes across the sky. Nothing is really said about war other than like, oh, look at this mass of people just moving. Reminds me of like when Steven Spielberg is showing like how bad the Holocaust is. So like let's just show a bunch of Jews just like walking, right, like to their deaths or something, right? That's supposed to be like a very like poetic look into like if you ever believed that the Holocaust was a good thing, I'm going to change your mind right now. And so let's just compare those techniques with what's happening with Slaughterhouse-Five, right? Let's maybe like jump around a little bit, give ourselves a little bit of rest, actually.
Sure. Well, and real quick, like just a couple more things that I'll say. So, like at the beginning of the second section, there's just all these like little silly, stupid, cutesy techniques that Pynchon
Mhm.
starts introducing as well, right? There's shortening of words a lot.
Mhm.
That's like supposed to be funny. So like I'll just read this little quick section right here. Like across a blue tile patio, in through a door to the kitchen. Routine. Plug in American blending machine, one from Yank last summer. Some poker game, table stakes, BOQ somewhere in the north. Never remember now. All right, already garbage. But chop several bananas into pieces. Make coffee in urn. Get can of milk from cooler. Puree nanas in milk. Lovely. Italicized. I would coat all the booze corroded stomachs of England. Dot 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 dot. Bit of marge. Still smells all right. Melt in skillet. Peel more bananas. Slice lengthwise. Marge sizzling. In go long slices. Light oven whoomp. Blow us all up someday. Oh ha ha yes. Peeled whole bananas to go on broiler grill as soon as it heats. Fine marshmallows.
Mm.
And this is like supposed to be a piece of a great American novel,
Yeah.
right? I mean, this is what I
And that's
mean.
and like is that like I don't even understand, like is that supposed to be like funny, like like it's a lot of times it's just hard to like understand what this is like going for, you know, like it's not
Yeah.
like it's not even humor by any like, you know, definition. Like what exactly is happening here, you know, why are these the choices being made, you
Yeah. I mean,
know?
I think he's trying to be humorous there. I think he's trying to do some little like, coring into the character's mind somehow,
Yeah, like a little
the
bit of
like
like stream of consciousness type thing, you know?
yeah, and like the dullness of his routine, but also he's still like getting a little bit of pleasure out of it and like ha 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 laughing to himself while he does all this. But like the fact that he puts, ah ha ha ha, like in the
Mhm.
text, right? It's in
Yeah.
the text, in like such a completely dull, non-fun. I mean, these were the moments when I was already like, yeah, I'm returning this thing and get my money back.
Mhm.
Um, but one other thought that occurs to me too, just in terms of like some of the early arguments we were making where people will defend this with the whole like it's either all a farce or it's so it's so disjointed and crazy and sloppy that it's meant to be like one large overarching metaphor for war itself or humanity and how it is like things are so crazy and insane and they're mixed up and you never know who you are or where you are. I mean, again, these things are so over the top and heavy handed that even if you want to make that argument, it's and that is what Pynchon was going for. It still doesn't really work. Um, but even if you compare a book like this to like say some of the like the more avant-garde music from that time,
Mhm.
like the late 60s, early 70s, right? So if you want to pick out stuff like Trout Mask Replica from Captain Beefheart,
Mhm.
or some of the stuff from the Velvet Underground, or some of the anguish that you have of music from the Doors, I mean, there's a lot of different like music's just kind of coming to mind because especially an album like Trout Mask, I don't know if you've ever listened to it, but it's like,
Yeah, I used to listen to it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it is so incredibly absurd and it's kind of like almost this, some of the techniques of this novel like applied musically, but like even that works better than something like this because I don't know, the machinery and the way music
Mhm.
operates, like you can do some of these like vignettes and snippets, and that's already how like albums are structured a lot of the time and whatever, and some of the like the angst and the absurdity can come through better in the dissonance and the way that the lyrics are ridiculous and all these kind of things. But like in a novel like this, I don't know, it just doesn't ever happen. It never
Yeah.
really congeals together in a way that you're like, yeah, he nailed something there that like stuck the landing. That was really good the way it all happened. You just never get that sense. And I think in Vonnegut you get that sense a lot. I mean, I within the first 3 or 4 pages of Slaughterhouse, you start laughing out loud. It's much funnier, much breezier, and he's got his own sets of techniques, some of which, again, like you said earlier, would be postmodern techniques, but they're just executed much better. So yeah, let's we can jump over there for some comparison if
Yeah,
you want.
and just like a comment we said, that's a good point about the musical comparison. I think part of the issue is, and I mean I sort of understand this because I remember when I was when I was a teenager and I was first kind of like thinking that I would be writing Like I remember like one time, like at an anti like Iraq war protest, and just sort of like sitting down, with like a notepad, and I was just kind of writing down my observations of everything that I saw, people's behaviors, what they were doing, just like sitting in the grass, just like watching things unfold. And it was also this kind of like similar like stream of consciousness type thing. And in the back of my mind though, I was just kind of thinking like, this is though kind of like formless, right? And it's kind of easy. I wonder if like, am I just like trying to like make things easy for myself, like, or like is there something else going on, or is this like worth exploring? um but the problem with that is like words and music are very different. Like the way that words function in the mind, the way that words function on a page, it's not the same thing as music, right? Like even those Beefheart songs are like what 3, 4, 5 minutes long a piece,
Right.
right? Maybe some longer ones, but generally speaking, they're not that long. And but this is an 800-page book, right?
Yeah.
And you take something what is supposed to be like an absurd set of comments, right, or like whatever, in a paragraph, and you simply replicate that again and again and again and again. There's no music as an offset, right?
Hmm.
There's nothing else to sort of latch onto,
Yeah.
and all you have really is just this kind of like implied set of like thematics that aren't even all that good. Like again, like great penises in the sky. Look at the what men have wrought, right?
Hmm.
So there's really nothing to work with, right? Like you know people really underestimate the power of words when they do things like this. They
Hmm.
misunderstand words, and they underestimate what words are capable of when they try to do shit like this. And even as a kid, I was sort of having this a thought in the back of my mind that I was just I was into like shit like this, right? And I was like thinking like I'm sort of doing something to make it easy for myself. And honestly, like even doing a show like this, it makes me feel a little bit sad because like I know that Pynchon is still alive,
Hmm.
and it makes me wonder like, okay, so like this is what he's known for. He's like what must be in his like 80s or 90s now. Does he like feel himself that he's like perpetuated some kind of like fraud or something? Like does he feel like that he's like wasted his life? And I know a lot of like fanboys might be like, oh, like this is just like the bitterness speaking. This is like Alex is like envy speaking. But the only way that a person could say that is this is a person that has never ever thought in his mind, hey, I'm capable of wasting my life. I'm capable of not living to my potential. Because if you in fact think about these things, like am I really living how I'm supposed to be living? If this is a thought that controls you, right, and you always try to sort of like whip yourself into shape, you're going to be thinking about this in reference to other people as well, right? And I do like honestly wonder, like knowing that in the back of my mind, I was thinking as a kid, like, am I just making things easy for myself if I'm choosing to run this way? He must have had that thought too, but he's much older now. Like, has it dawned on him? Does he feel like fuck? Like I could have written Slaughterhouse-Five, but instead I got Gravity's Rainbow. Does that bother in any way? And maybe that's like giving him too much credit in some ways, but I even though like I hate this book, like if that's what he's feeling, I would really really feel for him, right? I wouldn't want to like twist the knife into him, right, in that way, because it would be a very terrible state of affairs if this is what you're thinking, right? If you are if you have come to the conclusion that you have wasted away, right, when you could have done more. And not to say that I believe that he could have, but who knows? As far as I can tell, this book isn't even trying, right?
Yeah.
So
Who knows? I mean, the other thing about his approach over the years is that he's been very reclusive.
yeah,
He's really never been a public figure except very reluctantly. I think at one point, The Simpsons made him a character, and I think he might have voiced his own character. So, I mean, he's popped up with a couple little things here and there over the years, but for the most part, not a whole lot is known about him. He's kept in the shadows and stayed to himself, and perfectly fine. That's more
yeah,
people should do that,
yeah,
frankly, probably. But he also hasn't really come out to be a champion of his own work that I'm aware of, in terms of consistently defending it and trying to line out what he feels he's accomplished either. So obviously there have been awards for his work over the years and everything else, but yeah, who's to say? Who knows for sure?
Yeah, I mean, on some level, he must also feel like, well, why should I defend it? There's all these other people that would do it for me, right?
Maybe. Yeah.
That would do the impossible.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Do you want to square up Slaughterhouse right from the beginning of it, the epigraph? Because Slaughterhouse has an epigraph as well.
Yeah. So this is an epigraph from a it's a song, right? I forget the name of the song.
It's Away in a Manger. It's a Christmas hymn.
Oh yeah. The cattle are lowing, the baby awakes, but the little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. And this is an epigraph that it's actually directly referenced in the text. Let me get the what the pages are. So 252, right? So the narrator, I don't want to say Vonnegut, but the narrator in the text, who was a soldier in World War II, and is supposed to be like a Vonnegut stand-in, but to a degree, who's to say? This is how it's described. So speaking of the character Billy Pilgrim, the novel's protagonist, later on, as a middle-aged optometrist, he would weep quietly and privately sometimes, but never make loud boo-hooing noises. Which is why the epigraph of this book is the quatrain from the famous Christmas carol. Billy cried very little, though he often saw things worth crying about, and in that respect, at least, he resembled the Christ of the carol. The cattle are lowing, the baby awakes, but the little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. And I was just like wondering, like, what did you make of the epigraph? What was its purpose? I think, like, in the context of like war, for example, just reading those 4 lines, there is a sardonic and sinister quality to it, right?
Yes.
The quietness, like when you think about war, right? Like, what does Pynchon do? Let's talk about the screaming, right? What does Vonnegut do? Let's talk about the quiet, right? That's kind of like the difference between like writing a book about war, where war is the central focus and the death is the central focus, versus like what is the poetry and the energy in the air, maybe immediately before the war or immediately after the war, right? In the Vonnegut novel Bluebeard, right, with that, when Karabakian has the painting that he does, right, it's immediately after the war, right, and there's supposed to be like a poetry there. So anyway, like what did you think of the epigraph and its connections?
Yeah, well, first of all, I thought that this epigraph was a lot stronger than Pynchon's because it's not a try-hard epigraph, really, right? He just takes a little excerpt out of a Christmas carol, something that almost anybody, certainly in America, would know, right? You've heard this song, right? If you've grown up and you've had Christmas, going on and over the years, and it's familiar. It's something you've probably heard plenty of times. Whereas Pynchon picks a Werner von Braun quote. Maybe a lot of people are familiar with it, maybe not, whatever. But this is like a bit more accessible in a way. But then he definitely sets it up. I think your points are solid in terms of the quiet nature of some of the aspects of war and what happens, but also this idea of Jesus not crying, and so as a baby, which almost all babies cry, he doesn't cry. So you could read that on a couple levels. Maybe number one would just be with Billy, he's a good soldier. He's a standard man, who doesn't cry too much, and even though he sees things worth crying about, he just chooses not to, or he's so desensitized after his experiences in the war that some of these things just aren't really worth him crying over. Who knows? Also, maybe that this is someone with kind of like a different approach to the world, right? If almost all babies cry all the time, but then like the little Lord Jesus doesn't make any crying, I think in the carol, it's probably a way to set him up as a different sort of, right? He's supposed to be the savior, right? He's the Messiah. So maybe he's the one who can take on these burdens and the suffering of the world and not have the same response. He'll overcome it. And I think the final thing you would say is maybe in certain ways Billy does that a bit, right? He's got this unique mental ability to travel through time, and he sees things in the future and goes to things in the past and jumps around in the present and all these kind of things. That's something that really only a deity or a powerful entity would or should be able to do, yet he's just a normal optometrist from New York. So he's kind of given this ability. But I think the last thing I would say about it is just in these couple little tight paragraphs, Vonnegut sets this up as like, hey, if you were thinking that the protagonist of my novel, Billy Pilgrim, which also could be an allusion to something like the Pilgrim's Progress, right, which is another like Christian-centered novel and work of literature, in this respect, he resembles Jesus, but simply by saying that, he's almost saying, but really, like, he's not a Christ figure. Like if you thought he was supposed to be a Christ figure in this book, he's not. He's just a guy that I've invented or that I met, and knew and had some interesting capabilities. So it's just more ways of him kind of, I think, playing around with a lot of the typically entrenched cliches or ideas, within these kind of books in particular, where you've got to have like this strong central character who can save people or be heroic or whatever, and Billy is in like no ways heroic, really, right? He's kind of farcical and clumsy and still has some interesting things go on, almost despite himself. But Vonnegut saying, in that respect, at least he resembled the Christ of the Carol, I think is a little bit of a poke at Christ figures in novels over the years.
Yeah, and so like this directly leads us to the opening chapter. So the opening chapter has, it's not Billy Pilgrim speaking, right? It's the narrator, right? We are, it's easy to assume that this is directly talking about, Kurt Vonnegut himself. I haven't read exactly the context here, whether or not like Vonnegut said like, oh yeah, like this, this is, these are people that I in fact have known. But it's it does seem to have at least like many overlaps with his life, right? But again, for the sake of respecting that this is a novel, right, or we're going to call it narrator, right, not Kurt Vonnegut himself. So this is how the narration happens, right, in chapter 1, before we get to Billy Pilgrim and before we get to all these other characters. All this happened more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew really was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I knew really did threaten to have his personal enemies killed by hired gunmen after the war, and so on. I've changed all the names. I really did go back to Dresden with Guggenheim money, God love it, in 1967. It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio, more open spaces than Dayton has. There must be tons of human bone meal in the ground. I went back there with an old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare, and we made friends with a cab driver who took us to the slaughterhouse where we had been locked up at night as prisoners of war. His name was Gerard Mueller. He told us that he was a prisoner of the Americans for a while. We asked him how it was to live under communism, and he said that it was terrible at first because everybody had to work so hard and because there wasn't much shelter or food or clothing. But things were much better now. He had a pleasant little apartment, and his daughter was getting an excellent education. His mother was incinerated in the Dresden firestorm. So it goes. He sent O'Hare a postcard at Christmas time, and here is what it said. I wish you and your family also ask your friend Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I hope that we'll meet again in a world of peace and freedom in the taxi cab if the accident will. Then there's an ellipsis, and it says, I like that very much, if the accident will. Right. So, I mean, as an opening, this works on any number of levels. First of all, instead of like focusing on like, let's just have this like long description of all this like death and destruction, he decides to first he calls some doubt on the reliability, not only of like subsequent characters, but also his own narration, right? All this happened more or less, right? That tempers a little bit, some of the terror. He decides to focus on two little examples, right? One guy I knew, he was shot and dressed for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Some other guy, right? He threatened to have his personal enemies killed, right? And personal enemies, right? It's not like enemies of war, right? It's
Right.
just it's just like some guy that must have like, either already was psychotic, right, and joined the army, or maybe went psychotic because of the war, right?
Yep.
So there's that. Like, it's just a very different way of doing all this. He later on, he pivots almost immediately to, instead of like, let's just talk about how, like, woe is me, like, like all the typical narrative of World War II, meaning like, let's just focus just on the evil of the Nazis. uh he decides to give like a personal anecdote based on, this taxi cab driver, right? And his mother, right, was
Hmm.
incinerated. She was a civilian, right?
Yep.
She was incinerated in the firebombing. In fact, like, when you read about the specific directives, right, given, for something to address in firebombing, I forget if it was America or Britain that kind of codified it, but they were explicitly saying, like, the ideas are, we want to, terrify people, right, and lower morale, and B, kill people in the process, right? This is very sort of naked, right?
Yeah.
And again, this is a different way of tackling this idea. In no way this, and like all throughout, right? He decides to not make it. He doesn't make it about Nazism, right? There's no like, there's like some references obviously to the Holocaust. There's references to Jews. There's references to, like, lampshades made of human skin, and soap made out of a human fat, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, he's talking about the evils of war, period, of any side, of any past, of any future, of any present, right? Which is, again, that's kind of different. This is a fairly principled take, right? That is very hard to do, right? It's very easy to champion one war, right, while decrying another, right, and decry one war and champion another. Like, it's just very easy to do. So just like from a writerly perspective, like all the techniques and even just the ideas, right? This is unconventional, right? People don't normally do this. And again, there's also a lot of humor, right? You
Yep.
have, in like one page of text, you have like little funny moments right next to, moments of like total blackness, right?
Yeah.
Which presages, like, it sets up a structure for how the rest of the book will sort of have these techniques, even as new ones get introduced.
Yep.
Um,
Well, and a couple other things I want to read a little bit more just right at the very beginning here, because it's nice juxtaposition with Gravity's Rainbow as well. I mean, and we're going to have to contain ourselves because, as usual, like with good books, we got so many dog-eared
yeah,
pages. I'm sure
exactly.
same for you, right? So
Yeah,
like, so that we're not here for 6 hours and basically read everybody the whole book. We'll have
yeah.
to rein ourselves in. But just to continue on a little bit, and then I'll make a couple comments and we can keep moving forward. So, right at this is on page 2, right at the end of what you started reading. I like that very much, if the accident will. I would hate to tell you what this lousy little book cost me in money and anxiety and time. When I got home from the Second World War 23 years ago, I thought it would be easy for me to write about the destruction of Dresden, since all I would have to do would be to report what I had seen. And I thought too that it would be a masterpiece, or at least make me a lot of money, since the subject was so big. So right there, that even that one little paragraph lampoons something like Gravity's Rainbow, where just write a really long book about a really big subject and make it seem that it's got to be good then, right?
Mhm.
Everyone has to accept it on its own terms because of what it's about. But not many words about Dresden came from my mind then, not enough of them to make a book anyway. And not many words come now either, when I have become an old fart with his memories and his Pall Malls, with his sons full grown. I think of how useless the Dresden part of my memory has been, and yet how tempting Dresden has been to write about. And I am reminded of the famous limerick. There was a young man from Stamboul who soliloquized thus to his tool: You took all my wealth and you ruined my health, and now you won't pee, you old fool. And I'm reminded too of the song that goes, My name is Jan Janssen. I work in Wisconsin. I work in a lumber mill there. The people I meet when I walk down the street, they say, "What's your name?" And I say, "My name is Jan Janssen. I work in Wisconsin," and so on to infinity. So, a couple things. I mean, he introduces these couple little songs or limericks, which Pynchon sprinkles like many times throughout Gravity's Rainbow as well, and they're uniformly terrible and not funny at all. I think in Dan's essay, he talks about this trying to be an effort to like harken back to Greek, theater and this whole call and response thing, or the chorus that can speak as kind of an outside voice. But these are actually funny. And again, he's just using like, he's saying, I'm reminded of a famous limerick, right? So he's like using things that presumably other people might have heard or would know. And these are like just little colloquialisms, whereas all of Pynchon's are like made up and super self-reverential and, like inside jokey and not funny. But these, it's just him talking about his own struggle here, to write this book and kind of being open about that as the narrator. So again, just good little uses of these kind of techniques if you're going to put them in, and so on. But anyway.
Vonnegut did not create it, but and it's not it's not just that these limericks are funny and these like little asides are funny. They definitely have like this like wider sort of set of like reverberations, right? I mean, even in this introduction, right, he repeats like my name is Jan Janssen. Now the idea there is like like to infinity, like he's talking about a war, he's talking about his memory, right? He's talking about the fact that we are around here to report on Dresden, we are here to say something about it. But this has been going on forever in different forms, and it's probably going to be going on forever in the future, right? There's so much like reverb there, and whenever he like reintroduces, a line from a limerick or like something else, like there is a purpose there. It does something for the narrative, it does something for the character, it does something for the themes. And even like earlier on, like when he like page 2 is when the first time that the phrase "so it goes" appears, right? And like Pynchon doesn't have anything like that. He doesn't have like any phrase that is repeated that sticks in the memory that is supposed to connect things when it between. In fact, like in a little bit I'm going to be talking about that so-called famous giant adenoid scene in Gravity's Rainbow. And the fact that the word adenoid, it does appear after that scene much later in the book, but again, no reverb, no purpose, just like total, it's just pointless. So there, it's like so far, like there's like it's so tightly crafted so far, right? Despite using again many of the same techniques, many of the same Pomo like doubts on truth and narrative and all this other stuff, right?
Well, and so one last like early on section I'll quote from here, read and make a couple comments again, because this is what we're doing, right? We're trying to juxtapose how well Vonnegut does some of these things versus how poorly Pynchon does it. And we're taking some guesses and also using concrete examples. But on page 4, he talks about wanting to get in touch with old war buddies. And he says,
that's a great scene. Yeah.
He says, I had the Bell Telephone Company find him for me. They are wonderful that way, which like, I just laugh out loud every time I read that, because it's just like him talking about this giant faceless corporation being wonderful because they can find his friends for him. I have this disease late at night sometimes involving alcohol and the telephone. I get drunk and I drive my wife away with a breath like mustard gas and roses. And then, speaking gravely and elegantly into the telephone, I ask the telephone operators to connect me with this friend or that one from whom I have not heard in years. I got O'Hare on the line in this way. He is short and I am tall. We were Mutt and Jeff in the war. We were captured together in the war. I told him who I was on the telephone. He had no trouble believing it. He was up. He was reading. Everybody else in his house was asleep. Listen, I said, I'm writing this book about Dresden. I'd like some help remembering stuff. I wonder if I could come down and see you and we could drink and talk and remember. He was unenthusiastic. He said he couldn't remember much. He told me, though, to come ahead. I think the climax of the book will be the execution of poor old Edgar Derby. I said, the irony is so great. A whole city gets burned down and thousands of people are killed. And then this one American foot soldier is arrested in the ruins for taking a teapot. And he's given a regular trial, and then he's shot by a firing squad, said O'Hare. Don't you think that's really where the climax should come? I don't know anything about it, he said. That's your trade, not mine. As a trafficker in climaxes and thrills and characterization and wonderful dialogue and suspense and confrontations, I had outlined the Dresden story many times. The best outline I ever made, or anyway, the prettiest one, was on the back of a roll of wallpaper. And he goes on from there. Mm-hmm. But I just bring this scene up because, again, the whole like Bell Telephone Company, they're wonderful that way, getting someone on the line for him. So you can absolutely anticipate like Pynchon, if he were to use a technique like that, would probably make some like multi-page sojourn and aside into like a random character at the Bell Telephone Company, mm-hmm. and like make the operator some kind of like character for a while, and like get into the operator's head, and like, you know, it would just like, it would ruin the whole flow. It would try to be funny, but it would be pointless and stupid. And here, you know, just Vonnegut like skewers corporatism real quick with "they are wonderful that way." You know, it's so good. And then again, just casting doubt on himself, where he's asking his friend if he thinks that this would be a good climax for his own book, and his friend is like, "Well, I don't know. You know, that's your trade, not mine." And it's all just very funny. You know, like it's so well done and so tight. So anyway, I think it's kind of worth calling out.
Yeah, and speaking of Pynchon, I mentioned in the show notes that there is this sort of guide going around with like a list of characters from Gravity's Rainbow. Mm-hmm. And it's something like 700 characters. Now, this is like a very sort of generous estimate of, you know, the true characters, because like, I mean, just to like give an example, we have like page 315, the Aardvark woman, page 451, 495, 582, 684, Achtfaden Horst, right? Alice, 19, 3, maybe 12. Allan, Allan, appears only once, 547. You know, like, so basically, mm-hmm. like, so you have like 700 of these like little references, right? Let me see if Byron is in it. Is Byron considered a character here? I don't see it there, but I think Byron is a character.
Yeah.
And you know, like what you said about the telephone company thing, like, yeah, like in Gravity's Rainbow, that would become one of the characters, right? Yeah. And it would be a totally forgettable character. It would be a pointless aside. It would not, you know, do anything for the text. It would just be there for the sake of being there. You know, you have to think like, okay, if you have, like, to be generous, 700 characters and 800 pages, you by design, you know, are dealing with the superficial. You have to, you cannot in depth, you know, do anything with that, right? And you know, like just like, and pointlessly having, you know, them just cropping up and then disappearing and then nothing happening. I mean, like even here, like when O'Hare like says like that just like so it goes, this is the first instantiation. It appears again and again at critical narrative junctures, right? There's a reason for it. You have nothing like that in Gravity's Rainbow. You have like some like pointless repetitions of like things that don't go anywhere, but there's like an emotional sort of, you know, volatility here, right? While also just like remaining kind of stable, you know, from place to place. And as you were reading, I wouldn't have stopped where you stopped, because like the passage afterwards is just wonderful. So
it is.
So he's saying the best outline I ever made, or anyway, the prettiest one was on the back of a roll of wallpaper. I used my daughter's crayons, a different color for each main character. One end of the wallpaper was the beginning of the story, and the other end was the end. And there was all that middle part, which was the middle. And the blue line, so he's putting jokes even in there, right? Right. And the blue line met the red line, and then the yellow line, and the yellow line stopped because the character represented by the yellow line was dead, and so on. The destruction of Dresden was represented by a vertical band of orange cross-hatching, and all the lines that were still alive passed through it, came out on the other side. Now, he doesn't at all describe the destruction of Dresden here. He's simply referring to this, like, you know, brain map that he makes
Yeah.
And just by like, the figurations and the lines that he chooses to use, just like making this chart essentially, that tells you what you need to know, right? Like, and again, that's very postmodern. Now it's not postmodern in some kind of extreme over the top way that you cannot follow and you need some sort of fan synopsis to tell you what it's all about. But it still is Pomo, right? And it still is unconventional. It still is a new and interesting way of doing things, and it's effective, right? Which is the most important thing of all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even more important than being new, right? You have to ask yourself whether it's effective.
Yeah.
So, I wonder if there's anything else. Oh yeah, and
Well,
yeah, and also like, there's like tons of little jokes as well. Like when he's like thinking back to when he was in the war. Yeah, like in like page 8, an idiotic Englishman who had lost all his teeth somewhere had a souvenir in a canvas bag. The bag
mm-hmm.
was resting on my insteps. He would peek into the bag every now and then, and he would roll his eyes and swivel his scrawny neck, trying to catch people looking covetously at his bag. Right. That's the thing. Like even these modifiers, like notice how like the adjectives that he uses,
Mm-hmm.
they're so precise, right?
Yeah.
And they work so well. Whereas like Pynchon would have like a sentence with like 20 fucking adjectives that are so like random, right? Like Mark Twain says, the difference between the right word and the almost right word is like the difference between lightning and a lightning bug, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he would
Yeah,
bounce the
yeah.
bag into my insteps. I thought this bouncing was accidental, but I was mistaken. He had to show somebody what was in the bag, and he had decided he could trust me. He caught my eye, winked, opened the bag. There was a plaster model of the Eiffel Tower in there. It was painted gold. It had a clock in it. There's a smashing thing, he said. So like, all right, so he's like, making fun of like British slang, right? But he's using it
Yeah.
effectively,
Yeah.
right? And that's the thing, like this Gravity's Rainbow, like in that list of characters, this guy with the Eiffel Tower replica, he would make into the list of characters. But most likely, if you were then to go back to the text and look at it, this character have no function, no humor, no purpose, just there, right? Just to be there for the sake of being there. Here, like I remember this, like this is a funny scene, right? It's well
Yep.
sketched, right? Everything from this like, and that's the thing, like that's all you see about this character, but he's very human, right? Like you know people like this that like because they have so little, they become so adamant that this thing that they have is wonderful, right? And then the
Yep.
way that they describe it,
Yep.
there's a smashing thing, right?
There's a smash at the yeah. It's like and just him finding like that bit of pleasure about an Eiffel Tower replica in the midst of the
Yeah,
war. It's like it is kind of touching and
yeah,
endearing, and he has to show somebody what it is, and he doesn't. Yeah, I mean it is. It's just you smile a lot while you read this book. A couple more passages from this introductory chapter because it is so good. I mean, I put this in my notes to you. This is on my page 8, but he says, I think about my education sometimes. I went to the University of Chicago for a while after the Second World War. I was a student in the Department of Anthropology. At that time, they were teaching that there was absolutely no difference between anybody. They may be teaching that still. Another thing they taught was that nobody was ridiculous or bad or disgusting. Shortly before my father died, he said to me, you never wrote a story with a villain in it. I told him that was one of the things I learned in college after the war. So, I mean, again, just a real quick paragraph where he skewers some of these ideas that end up in higher education and how, he felt he couldn't put a villain in his novels because he had learned it in college that there were no bad people, and it's just humorous and funny.
mhm,
And on my page 11, he continues to try to get information about Dresden. He says, I wrote the Air Force back then asking for details about the raid on Dresden. Who ordered it? How many planes did it? Why they did it? What desirable results there had been? And so on. I was answered by a man who, like myself, was in public relations. He said that he was sorry, but that the information was top secret still. I read the letter out loud to my wife, and I said, secret? My God, from whom? So again, just
yeah,
lampooning the military and like this well-known horrific public event that they committed. It's like, oh, but the means by which you decided on literally exactly how many bombs and planes should go do it. Like, no, we can't tell you that.
mhm.
And so he just keeps cruising. There's all these different little moments like that throughout where he'll just keeps dropping it in, good
Mhm.
little moments, good little asides.
Yeah.
But then he goes to see Bernard O'Hare, and there's some funny things that happen there, right? When he's at their house. And so this is what I mentioned where, Pynchon uses the verb screaming uh, right in that first line of Gravity's Rainbow, and it's not that good. But here he's at O'Hare's house, and he's like building up in his mind what the experience is going to be like, right? So he's
Mhm.
he's looking forward to it. He thinks that he'll get to share, war stories with an old buddy. So he says, this is bottom of my page 12. Mary admired the two little girls I'd brought, mixed them in with her own children, sent them all upstairs to play games and watch television. It was only after the children were gone that I sensed that Mary didn't like me, or didn't like something about the night. She was polite but chilly. It's a nice cozy house you have here, I said, and it really was. I've fixed up a place where you can talk and not be bothered, she said. Good,
Mhm.
I said, and I imagined two leather chairs near a fire in a paneled room where two old soldiers could drink and talk. But she took us into the kitchen. She had put two straight back chairs at a kitchen table with a white porcelain top. That tabletop was screaming with reflected light from a 200-watt bulb overhead. Mary had prepared an operating room. She put only one glass on it, which was for me. She explained that O'Hare couldn't drink the hard stuff since the war. And so it goes on from there, and eventually he realizes that Mary's upset at him because she thinks that he's going to present, this war in the light of old wartimey men who mythologize it and glamorize it rather than the fact that they were just kids, teenagers, fighting, and that's how war always goes. It's young men dying for the greed or corruption or causes of old men.
Mhm.
So she does have a good reason, right? And it's kind of an interesting moment between them. But anyway, yeah, that moment made me laugh, and you can easily imagine this, right? It's tabletop screaming with reflected light from a 200-watt bulb, which is a really powerful light bulb. It's
Mhm.
like, such a bright bulb. So he's in this antiseptic operating room that he really doesn't want to be in, the
Yeah.
kitchen at their house. But
Yeah.
yeah.
So, and also, I mean, like throughout, there's like all sorts of like little things that stick with you. Like when he's talking about, like kind of like perceptions of the war, page 13. And my wife and I had lost our baby fat. Those were our scrawny years. We had a lot of scrawny veterans and their scrawny wives for friends. The nicest veterans in Schenectady, I thought, were the kindest and the funniest ones. The ones who hated war the most were the ones who'd really fought, right?
Mm-hmm.
Another comment, right? So like after, kind of like thinking about his past, right? We were United World Federalists back then. I don't know what we are now. Telephoners, I guess. We telephone a lot, or I do anyway, late at night, right? Just sort of like this idea that, the war passed, we expected all these positive developments, right? So, I mean, always like, after World War I, they were like, oh, it's never going to happen again. After World War II, again, same thing. It's never going to happen again. We're now going to be United World Federalists, right? But now, we're back to being telephoners, right? And we know what's happening, right? He's getting drunk. He's going to these sort of like, I'm going to randomly call people up type of thing. So, this little paragraph, like again, between like the ellipses, like very, very tiny, and yet it packs this both an emotional and intellectual punch, right? And also like speaking of like, like Pynchon's sort of like ill-wrought descriptions of like, bananas, a rocket being a steel banana in the sky. Um, so this is a more like examples of like how he is being like continually affected by the war even after the war. I took little girls with me. I took two little girls with me, my daughter Nanny and her best friend Allison Mitchell. They had never been off Cape Cod before. When we saw a river, we had to stop so they could stand by it and think about it for a while. They had never seen water in that long and narrow, unsalted form before. The river was the Hudson. There were carp in there, and we saw them. They were as big as atomic submarines, right? Very unexpected, right? He's just sort of standing there, right? First of all, like they're standing and they're thinking about the river, right? This is already a meditative book. Here's like another example. he sees the fish, and the only thing that he can think of is they were as big as atomic submarines. And I mean, it makes sense. Like, it first of all, like it sort of tells you what, where his brain is. But also, I mean, it's much more easy to imagine like a gray, big fish as a sort of like, submarine in the ocean, because that's what they're supposed to fucking be, right? Like a submarine is supposed to replicate the abilities of a fish. A banana in the sky is neither supposed to be steel nor in the sky, right? Like, so one metaphor is a failure, the other isn't. And on top of that, like, this metaphor is it allows you to know that he really has never escaped the war, right? And there's no like moralizing, there's no like, and isn't atomic war so bad? It's literally like, I just can't escape it. That's it. That's the moral, right? Anybody that goes through it, they will not escape it. That's the moral, nothing else.
Well, that's a good point, because that's really the flavor and the tone of the whole book, as far as the narrator's character. He'll bring up reminiscences, or he'll have moments like that where you get that sense, and he doesn't have to say much, but you understand it. But that's part of where the "so it goes" and so on. My name is Jan Janssen. He puts that stuff in there shortly after a lot of those kinds of moments, because it's still with him, but he's got this desire to still kind of keep moving forward in his life. It's present, and it's a specter, but it's not. He chooses to try not to dwell on it, more than he has to, or more than necessary. And there's like a really nice little poetic juxtaposition. This is on my page 18. So it's about him and his girls crossing the Delaware River. But it says, the two little girls and I crossed the Delaware River where George Washington had crossed it the next morning. We went to the New York World's Fair, saw what the past had been like, according to the Ford Motor Car Company and Walt Disney, saw what the future would be like, according to General Motors. And I asked myself about the present, how wide it was, how deep it was, how much was mine to keep. So, I mean, I know we keep saying this, but like, it's just so good, because he's got a little lampooning and skewering of corporate America right there, and the way that corporate entities invade our lives and are intertwined with them and shape the way that the public thinks about things and perceives things. But then he has this moment where, maybe he or his daughter's even like kind of enjoying the World's Fair, but kind of seeing it for what it is. But then just to the side, he just asks himself, about my present. How wide is it? How deep is it? How much is mine to keep? It's a really nice poetic little aside there.
And it comes out of nowhere, right?
It comes out of nowhere. Yeah, it's a nice, cutesy and leap. And then that's it. Right after that, I taught creative writing, the famous writers workshop at the University of Iowa. Right, so he just has that moment, shares it with you, and then moves on. So it just kind of leaves you to ponder it and interpret it. So again, really nice. It's good.
Yeah. And I mean, there's more like introductions of like phrases that become like fulcrums for the text, right? Later on, it is so short and jumbled and jangled, Sam, because there is nothing intelligent to say about a massacre. Everybody's supposed to be dead, to never say anything or want anything ever again. Everything is supposed to be very quiet after a massacre, and it always is, except for the birds. And what do the birds say? All there is to say about a massacre, things like "poti-wee," right? This introduces this thing, but it's a famous line now, right? And again, it's an unconventional way to deal with this. And like when you think about like books about war, right? It's always hard, right? Because it's very easy to just like devolve into cheap moralizing, devolve into like, oh, the horror in ways that just fall flat, because we all know about the horror, right? We understand what that is. But you also, unless you've been in it, you can't actually feel it. So like, what else can you do, right? And here he says, this is how I'm going to do it, right? I'm going to either give you, a character like Billy Pilgrim, who, like the Lord Jesus, no crying he makes, or I'm going to have the birds say nonsense things that they always say, right? not caring about war.
Yeah, do we want to real quick, I can just read the tail end of this chapter and then we can start talking about the rest of the book, the actual quote unquote book itself in a way. So toward the end of this first introductory chapter, he says, I looked through the Gideon Bible in my motel room for tales of great destruction. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar, I read. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah, brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. So it goes. Those were vile people in both those cities, as is well known. The world was better off without them. And Lot's wife, of course, was told not to look back where all those people and their homes had been. But she did look back, and I love her for that because it was so human. So she was turned into a pillar of salt. So it goes. People aren't supposed to look back. I'm certainly not going to do it anymore. I've finished my war book now. The next one I write is going to be fun. This one is a failure and had to be, since it was written by a pillar of salt. It begins like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. It ends like this. Petit wheat? So what do you think about this? Again, this is just like it's promo style.
I had this whole thing,
Yeah.
dog-eared notes, everything. It's a wonderful set of passages, right? And like it's you could tell that he's making fun of warmongers on any side, right? He says those are vile people in both those cities, as is well known, right? In the same way that again, we do the same fucking shit, right? We did it in Iraq. These are people that deserve it, right? Palestinians deserve it, right? Russians deserve it, right? It's always going to be the same kind of shit. This idea of being a pillar of salt, right? Like written, like just again, all this like all this reverb back and forth, right? It's very well done.
Simply looking back, looking back and trying
that being the sin, right?
Form an impression. Yeah, that's the sin.
That is a sin. And again, we have same thing now. Like everybody that criticizes war and warmongers, right? They are the sinners now, right? They are supposed to be turning into pillars of salt, right? We see it play out before us all the time, right? It's still happening. It's going to continue happening, right? Because the implicit argument that he's making throughout the book is, this is baked into the system, whether it's like biological, whether this is by some sort of like social design, right? It's kind of it's baked into it, he's trying to find a way out, right? And also like the way that it ends, right? Listen, like it begins like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come and stuck in time. It ends like this. Poti wheat, and then you go to the next page, and what do you have? Listen. Billy Pilgrim has come and stuck in time. Like it's literally there. Again, this is more postmodern techniques, but it's effective. It's funny, and not just that. Like it's just like the phrasings themselves are worthwhile, right? Like so, just get to like chapter 2. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. You remember that line, right? What does that mean? Like come unstuck in time.
Yeah.
Billy has gone to sleep a senile widower and awakened on his wedding day. He has walked through a door in 1955 and come out another one in 1941. He has gone back through that door to find himself in 1963. He has seen his birth and death many times, he says, and pays random visits to all the events in between, he says, right? Like, so like, again, casting doubt, right, on these memories, casting doubt on these characters. This is exactly the sort of thing that you should not necessarily expect, but these are the kinds of things that are effective, right, in books about war, right? Just flipping so much on its head. So
well, and and because as we come to find out, Billy is this character he chooses to focus on, but it's someone he was a soldier with in the war. And so some of these things that Billy is experiencing and the way it's described, we can infer even a little bit of that also reflects onto the narrator character and some of how he might feel about his own experiences, trying to go through his life and so on. But I mean, we're only 20 pages or so into Slaughterhouse. As everyone can tell, we're having much more fun already. Hopefully you are now more awake than
Yeah,
you were at the
definitely,
start. I
definitely.
figured once we got to Slaughterhouse and started reading how good some of Vonnegut's work is here, we'd both get a little bit more amped up. And there's plenty more we can go through. Do you want to take a quick break? We've been at it close to 2 hours. I could use a little more water.
Yeah, let's take a little break. Come back, and then we're gonna have to do the hard work again. We have to go back to
Gotta
Gravity's
go back.
Rainbow.
Yeah.
Now we have to go back to war, right? This is our Vietnam.
Oh, God.
Right. All right, so back to Gravity's Rainbow here. This is still section 2, right? So we have the banana breakfast, and then from the banana breakfast, we get into this other part, right? It's called like the famous giant adenoid chapter, right? And so Pirate Prentice, he like there's different characters, so like various kind of like psychic abilities, and I guess what he's able to do is he's able to kind of like vicariously live out other people's fantasies for them, or delusions or dreams or whatever it might be, so that they are not so kind of like racked by them, so that they could go on with their lives, and he could like temporarily shoulder the burdens for them. And at some point there is this character that is also working for the English. I forget exactly what his name is, but he maybe he has like something going on with his tonsils at some point, or maybe like something else happened, but he's like obsessed with this like fever dream of like the giant adenoid. And he is like so basically, his name is Lord Blatherard Osmo, is the man with these kinds of like strange delusions. And basically like Osmo is helped by Pirate Apprentice in this way. Pirate Apprentice ends up living this fantasy for him, and this is the way that it's described. And I just found it interesting because like this is considered like one of the I don't want to say it's like one of the key parts of the book, but it's a part of the book that lots of people talk about. And they're like, oh, yeah, you remember that scene? It's well written. It's wonderful. It's like compelling in some way. And reading it, I don't really notice that at all. So this is the way that it's described after Pirate Prentice goes through this fantasy. The first few times, nothing clicked. The fantasies were okay, but belonged to nobody important. But the firm is patient, committed to the long run as they are. And it's capitalized, right? Long run is capitalized and they is capitalized, right? We always have this kind of like, this conspiratorial they throughout the text.
Yeah.
At last, when proper Sherlock Holmes London evening, the unmistakable smell of gas came to Pirate from a dark street lamp, and out of the fog ahead materialized a giant organ-like form. Carefully, black shot step by step, Pirate approached the thing. He began to slide forward to meet him, over the cobblestone slow as a snail, leaving behind some slime brightness of street wake that could not have been from a fog. In the space between them was a crossover point, which Pirate, being a bit faster, reached first. He reeled back in horror, back past the point, but such recognitions are not reversible. And then in all italics, it was a giant adenoid, capitalized, at least as big as St. Paul's and growing hour by hour. London, perhaps all England, was in mortal peril! Exclamation point. So like this is like trying to be humorous, right, with the exclamations and everything else and the italics, but so far it's what do we have? We have like basically giant tonsils with leaving behind a slime, and that's supposed to be like a fantasy of some sort. This lymphatic monster had once blocked the distinguished pharynx of Lord Blatherard Osmo, who at the time occupied the Novi Pazar desk at the Foreign Office, an obscure penance for the previous century of British policy and the Eastern question. For on this obscure Sanjak had once hinged the entire fate of Europe. And this is like one of the ditties, right? One of the songs that he writes for the book. And I mean, you could judge for yourself whether or not it's clever or funny or doing anything. Nobody knows where it is on the map. Who would ever think it could start such a flap? Each Montenegrin and Serbian too, waiting for something right out of the blue. Oh, honey, pick up my Gladstone and brush off my suit, and then light me up my big fat cigar. If you want my address, it's that Orient Express to the Sanjak of Novi Pazar. Like it's not even like trying to be clever, like it's not even trying to be witty.
Yeah.
It's just
so many times with these, I would finish it, and literally the only thing that went through my head was, okay.
Yeah, it's not like there's no
okay.
like there's no attempt to do anything with it. It's just like it just happens to rhyme, and it's like you imagine it being sung in your head, but beyond that, there's really nothing. So chorus line of quite nubile young women, naughtily attired in busbies and jag boots, dance around for a bit here, while in another quarter, Lord Blatherard Osmo proceeds to get assimilated by his own growing adenoid, some horrible transformation of cell plasma it is quite beyond Edwardian medicine to explain. Before long, top hats are littering the squares of Mayfair, cheap perfume hanging ownerless in the pub lights of the East End as the adenoid continues on its rampage, not swallowing up its victims at random. No, the fiendish adenoid has a master plan, italicized. It's choosing only certain personalities useful to it. There is a new election, a new preteritron abroad. What is this? I don't know.
Preterition, I guess.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look up this word. Abroad in England here, I can imagine like a fan will be like, "Oh, you missed such the most critical part of this fantasy. The whole thing hinges on you knowing this word. If you don't know this word, do not fucking comment on this, you idiot." Right? I could just imagine that. Abroad in England here that throws the Home Office into hysterical and painful episodes of indecision. No one knows what to do. A half-hearted attempt is made to evacuate London. Black phaetons clatter in massive ant cortege over the trusswork bridges. Observer balloons are stationed in the sky. Guided in Hampstead Heath, just sitting, breathing, like going in and out. Any sort of sound there? Yes, it's horrible, like a stupendous nose sucking in snot. But wait, now it's beginning to, oh no, oh God, I can't describe it. It's so beast. The wire snap, the transmission ends, the balloon rises, and the teal blue daybreak. So I mean, like the humor is what, like people are being like consumed by a giant tonsil, right? At some point, like there was something else I wanted to say. Going near the end over here. So like after this adenoid is confronted and defeated, as the two of them snuffled back and forth, so now these characters are communicating with the adenoid through snuffles. As the two of them snuffled back and forth, alienists in black 7-button suits, admirers of Dr. Freud, the adenoid clearly had no use for, stood on step ladders up against its loathsome grayish flank, shoveling the new wonder drug cocaine, bringing hods full of the white substance and relays up the ladders to smear in the throbbing gland creature and into the germ toxins bubbling nastily inside its crypts with no visible effects at all. Though who knows how that adenoid felt, eh? So that's like supposed to be the punchline. That's literally supposed to be the punchline, right? Like there's like, smearing cocaine into this adenoid. And the punchline is, well, nobody asked how it felt, right? And I guess there's a second punchline. So Lord Blatherard Osmo is able to get back to work. But then he was found, quote, mysteriously suffocated in a bathtub full of tapioca pudding.
Yep.
And that's it. There's really nothing else. That's more or less how it ends, right? This is the so-called famous adenoid scene that we're supposed to say is clever, is memorable, does something, and nothing happens, right? There's not even maybe I could imagine maybe some writer that's like that's actually good could make something like this funny, but I even have doubts about that. I mean, the concept is just so like over the top, stupid, inane, like pointless. You would just have to ask yourself, like, why, like, why try, right? Like, why exactly even try to do this, right?
Well,
You need
it
some reason.
it literally reads like a high school kid trolling his English teacher during a creative writing exercise.
Yeah.
Does it not? Right? I mean, I had friends who would write shit like this just to be, not even necessarily funny, just literally to kind of troll and be like, all right, how about I just kind of like make up the most absurd and sort of
Yeah.
grotesque thing I can and turn that in, and then if we all like have to read passages of it in front of the class, I'll get to read that in front of the class. Ha ha, won't that be funny? I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
it's literally what it reads like. There's no like strong metaphor there. There's nothing that's particularly impressive. Again, the writing's just terrible. I mean, did anybody get any enjoyment out of listening to that? I don't know how they would, right? I mean, I'm grateful to you for reading that. That's a kind of a Herculean, takes a Herculean effort to read a lot of this book. And again, you finish that section, and my whole response was just cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's like, it's just so stupid.
And I mean,
It's the worst.
I wanted to read it because then I was like, all right, so you know how like Kurt Vonnegut has his like potty wheats and the ums and the so it
Yeah,
goes that are
yeah,
meant to like serve as fulcrums. I was like, all right, well, if there's this like so-called famous adenoid passage, maybe if I search through the rest of the text, because at least the word adenoid is distinctive, right? Most people would just say
hmm,
tonsil, right?
yeah,
Maybe it appears elsewhere in the book and there is some kind of reverberation elsewhere, right? Maybe it does something, and it actually does appear two more times in the text. And
yeah,
these are the context, right? This is like about 3/4 into the book, and then again almost near the end. um the row is a game too. Soiree sits grinning with an ivory spoon, shoveling incredible piles of cocaine into his nose, going through his whole repertoire, arms straight out, swinging in a giant curved zoom precisely to the nostril he's aiming at, then flicking in the lot from 2 feet away without losing a crystal. Then a whole bunch gets tossed up in the air like a piece of popcorn and nose gobbled on target inside where it's as smooth as a Joe block. Not a cilium in sight there since the Liebknecht funeral, if not before. Hand-to-hand shifts of spoon 2 or 3 times faster than ivory ever moved in air. Rails disappearing in a wink without benefit of a tube to guide them. Sound is a game if you're capable of moving that far. You adenoidal closet visionary. That's why I listen to Spohr, Rossini, Spontini. I'm choosing my game, one full of light and kindness. You're stuck with that stratosphere stuff. It rationalizes its dullness away by calling it enlightenment. You don't know what enlightenment is, Curl. You're blinder than I am. So Soiree is like this drug dealer, right? He sells cocaine. And I guess like the connection is they shoved cocaine, into the adenoid, and here they're, doing cocaine here as well. Is
yep,
that the fucking connection? Like, and that's the thing. Like in some of these summaries, this is exactly the connection they would make. Like, oh, this connects back to that adenoid from the very beginning of the book. Now we're at the end of the book, and both of them have this like cross referencing of cocaine. All right, you
hmm,
always
hmm,
you can't just say that. You always have to give a reason why, right? So what, right? You have
yeah,
to, if you cannot answer the question, so what, right? It's not worth championing, right? As a positive part of the artistic process, right? It's
hmm,
not, it's not an artistic product. It's just some bullshit. And then the word appears two more near the very end when Gottfried is in the 00000 rocket, and Richard M. Schlub. I'm guessing that's like, from what I've read, like that's supposed to be like perhaps like a reference to Richard M. Nixon. But here he's a uh, owner of something called the Orpheus Theater in Los Angeles. I'm not exactly sure what the sort of political comment, what the sort of intelligent sort of thing being said here. But anyway,
yeah,
Los Angeles PNS. This is like supposed to be almost like a little newspaper excerpt. Richard M. Schlub, night manager of the Orpheus Theater on Melrose, has come out against what he calls, quote, irresponsible use of the harmonica, or actually harmonica, since manager Schlub suffers from a chronic adenoidal condition which affects his speech. Friends and detractors alike think of him as the adenoid. Oh, yeah, because people hated Richard Nixon. So let's just call him a giant fucking tonsil that maybe uses cocaine, right? It's like this is the level of humor and commentary that this book provides, right? I mean, like, it would be interesting if we do get like fanboys in the comments, like these specific objections, these specific scenes, like stop for a second with the fucking abstractions. We gave you specific scenes, we gave you specific passages. Defend those specifically, right? Don't start, throwing out some, highfalutin terms. Don't start, giving me some like wider thematics. Explicitly defend these passages, explain what they mean, why they're funny, why they work, why they even have to be there. Because like it's just like, yeah, that's the thing. Part of the reason why like I resented like reading this book is like I knew how much work it would take, and here I am, like I'm doing all this fucking work and I'm not getting anything from it, right? If I'm at night, and I have like a book of Russian poems, it takes me a while, to read through the Russian, look up some like, archaic terms that I don't know. That takes work, right? And that takes concentration. So does this, but I get something out of that. Here, what am I getting here? Like I looked up all these like analyses, right? I'm trying to figure out like, okay, how many times does this word appear, right? Like I'm actually like trying to take this seriously. Meanwhile, the fanboys are like, oh no, you shouldn't have taken seriously. It's a farce, right? Don't take it seriously, right? Like here, like I'm actually trying to do something with this, right? So again, if anybody wants to defend this, like feel free. Like the comments are always open, even for totally stupid comments. Like I don't delete stupid comments. You could be stupid, it's fine. But I will respond, right? And you might not like that. But
and it should be said that the structure and the writing style of this first part of the book with the vignettes, I think is it 21 vignettes in total, something like that, give or take. I don't know,
maybe, but like I don't even know.
Not that it really matters, although fanboys would probably say it matters. It's such that because nothing interesting or relevant or important or insightful is happening, it's just excruciating. I mean, you just want it to be over. There's so much jumping around from one character to another, and just really you're not getting any payoff as the reader, that by the time that section 2 rolls around, it literally almost feels like a breath of fresh air in the context of this book, because he resumes somewhat for a little while there. I mean, and this is kind of where I stopped, right around page 215. But there's somewhat of like a normal narrative structure that returns, where he just kind of like runs with a few scenes that seem to happen kind of one after the other, with Slothrop at the beach and the octopus that attacks one of the women they're with, and then he ends up,
Katya, that Dutch agent, that that octopus was octopus is a ploy, right, to sort of get to Slothrop, right?
Yeah, the octopus has been like trained or something. But then he also ends up sleeping with, is it Katya or is it a different woman that in the hotel he sleeps with and then wakes up? I think it might be Katya, and she like takes all his clothes, so he's naked. And
it might be her, it might be someone else, but
I really can't remember which. Again, is just an indictment of the book, right? This is like one of the more memorable scenes from the entire.
All the characters just kind of like like it doesn't matter which character it was, right? They're just the same bland mush.
Yeah, it's just gruel. But yeah, so anyway, I mean, he ends up like running around this hotel like naked and kind of like looking for his clothes, and he falls out of a tree in front of some military officers and stuff. And it's like, again, these are the kind of things that maybe in Vonnegut's hands or another capable writer could be funny or entertaining. And keep in mind, again, this is like the book has improved at this turn, right? And still, it's still so poor, so bad. And maybe these things could be funny. Maybe they could have some kind of echo or something deeper going on, but they really just don't. I mean, again, it's just kind of literally Pynchon sitting there dreaming up, what would be some absurdist thing that could happen? How could I also be called a surrealist somehow? When I write this book, a trained octopus on the beach could attack some people. And I mean, it's just like, it is so indulgent of like all of the worst cliches and expectations of that time. And on and on. I mean, even just that little adenoid sketch you read from much later in the book with the cocaine dealer and stuff. And like, he has to name drop that while he does cocaine, he listens to some obscure classical composers.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, it just, he cannot fucking resist that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's incredible how it never gets resisted.
And it's also
never gets pared back.
And it's also so like unrealistic. I mean, people that are like cokeheads, that's not the music that they listen to, right? A cokehead is a certain kind of person. But and that's the thing. Like before we started recording, like I was just saying how just like reading this book, you're talking about like self-indulgences, like it didn't start with this book, obviously, but it's very sort of symptomatic of this trend. Like, I'm very I'm very nervous that like going forward, art is just becoming so increasingly just like nothing more than just like pure like self-indulgence and like titillation, right? And it's like titillation of like the lowest sort, right? It's not it's not a titillation that gets you anywhere. It's not an indulgence that coming out on the other end there's like some kind of like there's some kind of insight or something to work with, or even like even if it's not like great in and of itself, like perhaps like you could build on top of it somehow. There's nothing in this book that you could really build on top of, except in like if you make like the most sort of like generic sort of statements about it. And just a conceptual say like, well, let's try X, let's try Y. The fact that there's no like over the top moralizing strain in a book about war, let's try that. Those are good things, like, but beyond that, like specifically you latch onto these like statements, you latch onto these paragraphs, and nothing happens. It is all self-indulgence, and this is exactly the trajectory that we're going on. Like everything, it ultimately becomes self-indulgence, right? And not just in the arts. Like I feel like even politics, right? When people like are on Twitter, they're cheering for their preferred. Right now, they're in fucking Twitter, like cheering for the overtaking of Twitter by Elon Musk. Let's replace one oligarch with another oligarch, right? They're like cheering for their preferred oligarchs. Like it's just so depressing. Or like their preferred political party, right? It's all and nothing of course ever really matters, right? Nothing really changes. Anyway, this book is very much symptomatic of this. It's the same trend.
Yeah, for sure. I did want to give just like one or two passages a read from Gravity's Rainbow where I thought there was like a little bit of decent writing, just to try to highlight these things. So this was on page 23, I think, where Tantivy Mucker Maffick, I think is this character's name. And again, these names are like so terrible too, right? It's like
what page?
Page 23.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm going back a little bit. But just to show that like Pynchon is capable of like some decent writing, if you want to call it like his own style a little bit. It's still this like dense kind of webby style that goes on. It's like it's not particularly pleasurable, but it is a little bit unique to him. But I think this is where he's looking at this map with Slothrop's map, the silver stars that he's got on there where the V2s have hit, and he's also had sex and whatever. So it says the map does puzzle Tantivy. It cannot be put down to the usual loud-mouthed American ass banditry, except as a fraternity boy reflex in a vacuum, a reflex Slothrop can't help, barking on into an empty lab, into a wormholing of echoing hallways, long after the need has vanished and the brothers gone to World War II and their chances for death. Slothrop really doesn't like to talk about his girls. Tantivy has to steer him diplomatically even now, At first, Slothrop, quaintly gentlemanly, didn't talk at all till he found out how shy Tantivy was. It dawned on him then that Tantivy was looking to be fixed up. At about the same time, Tantivy began to see the extent of Slothrop's isolation. He seemed to have no one else in London, beyond a multitude of girls he seldom saw again, to talk to about anything. Still, Slothrop keeps his map up daily, boobishly conscientious. At its best, it does celebrate a flow, a passing from which, among the sudden demolitions from the sky, mysterious orders arriving out of the dark laborings of nights that for himself are only idle, he can save a moment here or there, the days again growing colder, frost in the morning, the feeling of Jennifer's breasts inside cold sweaters' wool held to warm a bit in a coal smoke hallway he'll never know the daytime despondency of. And it just goes on and on. There's like a bunch of ellipses and a bunch more descriptions, and it starts to like really, fade out again, and it just becomes awful. But I mean, he's got like some decent turns of phrase, some decent sentences in there,
and some characterization too, like there's some,
barking into an empty lab, into a wormholing of echoing hallways long after the need has vanished, so like, I mean, and Dan says this in his review too, right? He makes an effort to point out some passages. This isn't one of them, but some of his own that he wanted to talk about, where like there's at least a little bit of promising writing or a decent start to an idea or whatever, and then it just like absolutely crashes and burns within, like I said at the beginning of our talk here, within like the same page or within the next paragraph or whatever. And I had pulled out a couple other examples too. I mean, we've already read enough of this book, I think, but there's just the problem being anything that's somewhat promising or decent is never really capitalized on, and then 90+% of it is not at all. There's just nothing there, and yet you as the reader are forced to sit there and try to make something of all of it, and if you can't, it's your fault, or you just don't get it, sort of thing. I mean, classic Pomo stuff.
Yeah. There's this other part on page 54. This is section 9. So there's a character, Roger, a Mexico, who works in statistics. He's the one that's like trying to figure out exactly what's going on behind these this like map of like sexual exploit versus here's a V2 crash, and so he's having an affair with this woman, Jessica Swan Lake, right? It's just Jessica Swan Lake, and so basically, like I when I was reading one of the summaries, this is in the summary from what's his name? So this is Michael David Bell. This is I guess one of the like famous summaries from Williams.
Real quick, before you read this, can we just say about the names? The absurdity of the names, like Vonnegut does this too, right? In Slaughterhouse-Five, you got Kilgore Trout, Billy Pilgrim, Montana Wild Hack. Like they're absurd and they're crazy. But doesn't that just seem to make the argument that Pynchon would have almost had to certainly have read Slaughterhouse-Five? Because I just don't believe that of his own accord, he's sitting there like, wouldn't it be hilarious if there were characters called Tantivy Mucker Maffick and Jessica Swan Lake and Roger Mexico and Tyrone Slothrop? I just don't believe that. There weren't two American authors like sitting there within a few years of each other, both with their list of like absurdist, crazy made up names. And of course, there's so many characters in Gravities, and so he's forced to like reach so hard so often to come up with like the next insane, Pirate Prentice, like the next insane name. Whereas like some of the characters in Slaughterhouse at least have kind of normal names. You've got Edgar Derby and Roland Weary and whoever else, right? Howard Campbell. So like he's got a mix where it's like it's not overdone, and the ones that are in there therefore are kind of funny and they stand out to you. And Kilgore Trout is such an interesting and funny character that of course is a big part of the Vonnegut universe anyway. But I just had to say that because it's like that was one of the main things, especially since Slaughterhouse came out first. And like I just feel like he probably read this book and decided to try to rip that idea and then did it horribly. So I mean, anyway, sorry I interrupted you.
In Dan's review, he also mentions like some similarities, like with some sex scenes and other things going, back into Slaughterhouse-Five. So I mean, look, like, I mean, artists do this, right? They look at, what is like the best thing out there, right? How can I sort of make it better, bigger, whatever, right? And maybe this is his idea, like, okay, if he's gonna have Kilgore Trout, I'm gonna have Jessica Swan Lake times 1,000, right? I'm
Yeah,
gonna have a
yeah,
thousand of these characters that all sound stupid. Um, so
yeah.
anyway,
Anyway,
yeah, so like the title of this page is some things that happen more or less in Gravity's Rainbow. And that's the thing. And when I read this, like immediately, even this title, like this is going
yeah,
back to that first, that opening line in Slaughterhouse-Five, right?
yep.
These things really did happen, right? More or less. So anyway, this is Michael David Bell from Williams College. And so in section 9, Roger and Jessica are having this affair, and Roger is trying to explain to her that the path that these rockets travel and where they crash, it's a Poisson distribution, right? Which is like, how to summarize it, it's like taking, it's like taking the mean of like average like divergences or whatever. It's like supposed to be like, like anyway, like something like that. And
Cool.
for whatever reason, this is supposed to be like significant. I do
Yeah,
find it interesting that the guy, it seems like Michael David Bell, says people that math that harvard.edu. So this is maybe this is a guy that is like, he's a mathematician or something. Maybe like he finds this cool. Maybe this is what attracted to him. But there's nothing about the fact that this is a Poisson distribution versus like any other fucking thing
yeah,
that makes it, worthwhile, right? And so after like, so this is the interaction that they have, right? As Roger's trying to explain this concept to her. Roger has tried to explain the V-bomb statistics, the difference between distribution and angel's eye view over the map of England and their own chances as seen from down here, right? So they're trying to also like, they're like in these like outlawed zones, right? You're not supposed to be in certain zones because you might get hit by a rocket or something. But they're like these like sort of they're these illicit lovers, right? So they're constantly going in places where they're not supposed to be going. Um, so she's almost got it. Nearly understands his Poisson equation. It can't quite put the two together. Put her own enforced calm day to day alongside the pure numbers and keep them both in sight. Pieces keep slipping in and out. Why is your equation only for angels, Roger? Why can't we do something down here? Couldn't there be an equation for us too? Something to help us find a safer place? Why am I surrounded, his usual understanding self today, by statistical illiterates? There's no way, love, not as long as the mean density of strikes is constant. Pointsman doesn't even understand that. The rockets are distributing about London, just as Poisson's equation in the textbooks predicts. As the data keep coming in, Roger looks more and more like a prophet. Psi section people stare after him in the hallways. It's not precognition. He wants to make an announcement in the cafeteria or something. Have I ever pretended to be anything I'm not? All I'm doing is plugging numbers into a well-known equation. You can just look it up in the book and do it yourself. So when they start like arguing about this, um, uh, uh, it's like more or less kind of like similar to what we just saw. And what struck out to me, like, first of all, like I would not have even like discussed this like section. I mean, there's really nothing here to discuss. But in looking at this like famous summary, the way that this mathematician, it seems, characterizes it is, quote, some oppositions emerge: science versus love, war versus love, right? Like it's like this, let's take the most like abstract high level version of what we just saw, right? They're two lovers, they're talking about statistics, they're in the middle of a war, and instead of like discussing specifically whether or not this is well written, whether or not the fact that this is a Poisson distribution, whether or not this is like clever or relevant or compelling in any way, let's just talk about, the kind of, timeless themes of science versus love, of war versus love, right? And this is exactly what the fans like do again and again and again. Like any literally like any synopsis that you read, any of these wikis that you read, they force all these interpretations into, like, later on there's like some sort of like funeral procession, and then one of these summaries is like in parentheses JFK. It's like, based on what? Because you want it to be, because you want it to be some kind of comment on American politics and American history, you know. And even if it is JFK, who gives a shit? And you know, like, you have to be able to answer that question. So what? You know, so many people cannot answer that. So what? They just want to get away with, you know, just the name drop, and that in and of itself is supposed to be sufficient. So and so like section 10, and I guess like after this we could like jump immediately back into Slaughterhouse-Five, because there's a section there that I want to talk about that is a little bit similar. So by section 10, so like now these like British scientists, they have this like grand idea that they're going to exploit German racism by tricking the population into thinking that these V2 rockets were in fact invented by like African scientists. And that is supposed to, like, don't fucking yawn. You have to get through this.
I know, right? You see what I'm saying?
And these scientists, right? They're supposed to be like these like African scientists, and that's supposed to like get into like the Germans' brains, like, oh my god, like we, you know, like we're supposed to hate these people. They're supposed to be lesser than us, and that's supposed to like kind of like, you know, brainwash the population into turning against Hitler or something, right? These are like the, you know, again another like inane fucking idea, presaging. But you know, interestingly enough, like this like weird Thomas Pynchon shit, like it does presage some of the, you know, other like cultural currents that seemingly have nothing to do with this, like, you know, like that whole, you know, the whole like Hotep Renaissance. You know what I'm talking about? How you have like tons of like, you know, like tons of like, you know, black people going around, you know, saying shit like, you know, like, you know, that meme, we was kangs, right? Like, you know, so like it's like, you know, let's like it is interesting, at least, that like these very like reflexive and reactionary, you know, parts of like American culture now, these like niche pieces of American culture, they have like inklings, you know, going on, you know, even in like stuff like Gravity's Rainbow, right? Like there's, you know, and that's the thing, like artists are supposed to, instead of like, you know, being battered by the currents, like they're supposed to throw lens on things. They're supposed to be prophets in some ways. They're supposed to, you know, offer this kind of understanding. But instead we just have like, you know, Pynchon is just kind of like being thrown into these like waves that he's like noticing, maybe, right? And he's just like a part of this, like just being haphazardly hit this way, pushed that way, you know, in a very reactive fashion, as opposed to like, you know, building something from it, right? So I found that little piece interesting. But anyway, so in section 10, as they're trying to like, you know, build this like propaganda thing that Africans were in fact the true inventors, and this is going to really hurt the German psyche. The way that they do this is they try to get into Slothrop's mind and try to like see, well, what kind of reflexive racism does he have, and what hints from that can we use to apply to the German psyche. And all that we get is just like, you have like sort of these like, you know, spectral black figures in the scene, and there's like these like, you know, black American dances or whatever going on. And that is like somehow supposed to make Slothrop uncomfortable. I mean, maybe it does. I mean, like, who knows? And later on, like, as it becomes like very kind of like, you know, like very kind of, you know, scatological humor, there's this very weird set of connections between like the color of shit and like the color of black people that is made, which is just like, it's just so, you know, like, again, what comment is being made here? Like, even if this is supposed to be like an anti-racist track, first of all, it's kind of hard to read it that way. I mean, there's no discernible commentary, right? And it goes on for so long, right? And then it goes into like this like vomiting fantasy that he's having, and it's very, very long. It's very, very pointless. And then you look at something like Slaughterhouse-Five, and although it barely, you know, touches on race, right, in the same way that this book barely touches on race in any way, they both decide to touch on race. And here we have the way that Kurt Vonnegut decides to deal with race, right? So we have on page 74, at least in my book, we have this like little section on rioting, and it's very, very quick, right? You could miss it very easily, and yet it says so much. It prefigures what we see today in a way that, whereas Pynchon is very kind of reactionary and sort of like being hit by sort of the waves of culture, Vonnegut is really sort of explaining to you, this is going to happen again, and these are the things that people will say, and this is how the response that you formulate needs to look like. So on page 74, Billy's smile as he came out of the shrubbery was at least as peculiar as Mona Lisa's, for he was simultaneously on foot in Germany in 1944 and riding his Cadillac in 1967. Germany dropped away, and 1967 became bright and clear, free of interference from any other time. Billy was on his way to a Lions Club luncheon meeting. It was a hot August, but Billy's car was air-conditioned. He was stopped by a signal in the middle of Ilium's Black Ghetto. The people who lived here hated it so much that they had burned down a lot of it a month before. It was all they had, and they'd wrecked it. The neighborhood reminded Billy of some of the towns he had seen in the war. The curbs and sidewalks were crushed in many places, showing where the National Guard tanks and half-tracks had been. And I mean, this is such a perfect response to all the like fucking virtue signaling from 2020 about the goddamn riots, right? Glenn Lowry, the riots, the riots, John. It's so immoral. It's so bad. Here's what he says about it, right? They hated living in this ghetto so much that they had burned it down. Why didn't that thought cross Glenn Lowry's mind when he was like virtue signaling about this shit? Like, isn't that really what it comes down to? You hate this so much. You hate being around it. There's nothing for you. So even the little that you do have, you might as well cast away, right? This is such a perfect, take on, again, it barely touches on race, but to the extent that it does, it's just this little bit. And it says so much more about Black America, about these kinds of virtue signals, about the reasons why people might riot, and about the responses that people have, going forward, than like 30 pages of this like dumb, like aside on, let's try to get into the mind of Slothrop and try to like figure out like what's going on with him, just so we could brainwash Germans into, this like mass propaganda campaign or whatever. Anyway, like it's again, just an incredible. So this is literally just one short paragraph, and it does so much,
Yep. Yeah, that's the difference between the two, as we keep pointing out.
Just there's this other little piece, like it's there's another like little ellipsis, right? And there's even a shorter paragraph, and this is what it is. Blood brother, said a message written in pink paint on the side of a shattered grocery store. There was a tap on Billy's car window. A Black man was out there. He wanted to talk about something. The light had changed. Billy did the simplest thing. He drove on, right? Again, like perfect, fucking perfect, yep. Right? It tells you everything you need to know about white America, how it responds to such things, and also just the fear, right? Like wanted to talk about something. This might as well, this very well could have been a robbery, right? In progress, yep. Right? Which is why, he drove away, right? Maybe he had like a bad feeling about this, but instead of like, resolving it in any way, what else can he do? What is he going to do? I mean, he has money, but what is he going to do? Right? He just drives away. He's able to get away from the situation. He's, in this air conditioned Cadillac, he's completely, apart from this world. But anyway, like this is, it's wonderful in that way. I mean, do you want to tackle anything next? I feel like we should go back a little more to Slaughterhouse-Five now. Yeah. The chaser.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I wanted to call out this is on my pages 74 to 75, where he details bombings and some of the events of the war in reverse.
Oh, yeah. I was going to talk about that too. Yep.
Yeah. So just talk about this as a technique and how well executed it is and how effective it is. So let's see. Let me see where it starts. I'll start at the bottom of my page 73. Billy looked at the clock on the gas stove. He had an hour to kill before the saucer came. This is the flying saucer from Tralfamadore. He went into the living room, swinging the bottle like a dinner bell, turned on the television. He came slightly unstuck in time, saw the late movie backwards, then forwards again. It was a movie about American bombers in the Second World War and the gallant men who flew them. Seen backwards by Billy, the story went like this. American planes full of holes and wounded men and corpses took off backwards from an airfield in England. Over France, a few German fighter planes flew at them backwards, sucked bullets and shell fragments from some of the planes and crewmen. They did the same for wrecked American bombers on the ground, and those planes flew up backwards to join the formation. The formation flew backwards over a German city that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted a miraculous magnetism, which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers into the bellies of the planes. The containers were stored neatly in racks. The Germans below had miraculous devices of their own, which were long steel tubes. They used them to suck more fragments from the crewmen and planes. But there were still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were in bad repair. Over France, though, German fighters came up again, made everything and everybody as good as new. When the bombers got back to their base, the steel cylinders were taken from the racks and shipped back to the United States of America, where factories were operating night and day, dismantling the cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did this work. Great commentary right there.
Yeah.
The minerals were then shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them into the ground, to hide them cleverly, so they would never hurt anybody ever again. The American flyers turned in their uniforms, became high school kids, and Hitler turned into a baby, Billy Pilgrim supposed. That wasn't in the movie. Billy was extrapolating. Everybody turned into a baby, and all humanity, without exception, conspired biologically to produce two perfect people named Adam and Eve, he supposed.
So fucking good. You know,
It's so good.
fucking good. And that's the thing,
Yeah.
that we both want to talk about the same passage. If
Yeah.
you know, like it's perfectly random that I decided to talk about the adenoid, whereas you from Gravity's Rainbow would have like talked about something else, because it's all, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what scene you look at. It doesn't matter, right?
No, but this is just a gem of a couple pages, you know, and there's no further comment on it either, right? Again, part of the difference between these two writers and part of the beauty. Like, if Pynchon had had the wherewithal to think of a technique like this and to use it, and for all I know, maybe he does at some point from page 215 to 770 or whatever it is, probably not, or you probably would have mentioned it. It would have gone on forever. It would have detailed every gory little detail. It would have like focused in on the thoughts of an individual grenade fragment in one person, and that grenade is like a character now. You know what I mean? Like, if anybody doesn't get this by now, that would have been the approach, or disagrees with you and me, that would have been the approach. They didn't read the book, and they don't know what his shtick is going to be. Here, Vonnegut takes 2 pages and details all of the horrors of war, but puts it in reverse in this way where you can imagine this happening. And it's a commentary about the possibility for healing that could be there, the possibility for never committing these atrocities that could have been there, the fact that even women are complicit in something like this by going to work in factories, and, you know, the Arm and Hammer lady or whatever, you know, be strong in the war and make all these weapons, and on and on. Nobody's atrocities are committed on all sides. That's one of the comments I made to you. You know, he does that very well with some of the other characters as well. And it's so well written, and it's so concise. And like, I mean, I almost feel bad for like having kind of chuckled through this when I read it just now, and when I read it the first time, and every time since. But like, the reason I kind of laugh a little bit is because he's so good. Like, his technique is like literally kind of like bringing you a bit of joy.
It's nervous laughter, right? It's bringing out. Yeah, I was feeling emotional as it was being read, like where factories were operating night and day, right? For one purpose only, right? For one purpose, which is the dismantling and nothing else.
Dismantle it, and go put the minerals back in the ground, hide them as far away, as cleverly as you can, you know. And it's just it's so excellent. I mean, it's one of my favorite passages in the
Yeah,
whole book.
and if you think about like even like when you start thinking about like the implications in reverse, right? Meaning forwards again, if they're being hidden cleverly away, what that means in reality is
Yeah.
human beings are searching in the most impossible places, right?
Hmm.
To find weapons of mass destruction so they could wreak havoc on the world, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And on
And
each other.
and
Yeah.
that's the implication, right? So
Yeah. Well, and the final thing I'll say, and then you can make whatever other comments you want about this passage, is the other reason why it's so good is because this is happening to Billy's character,
yeah,
right? He's watching a late night movie. He's doing
yeah.
something we all do in life, but he came slightly unstuck in
Mm-hmm.
time, not wholly, just slightly. And so he ends up seeing this movie play both forwards and backwards, and it's an excellent in
Mm-hmm.
to his character all over again, while you get the treat of
Mm-hmm.
reading good writing like this, and a really clever way to present the horrors of war and make all the comments you need to make on it, but then leave it
Yeah.
alone and move on to the next scene. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
brilliant.
To the extent that, yeah, this is happening to Billy. Another interesting part of this book is Billy Pilgrim. He's not necessarily like, he's not the, like the most likable. He's not like smart or anything, right? He doesn't really say much about the war or anything like that. So he's in some ways, like parts of him are this kind of blank canvas, and he's
Hmm.
made to experience this thing backwards, right? The narrator is the one that's talking about supplying all this, and you, the reader, you're the one that's supplying the implications, right? You're the
Hmm.
one that understands what this means. Whereas Billy Pilgrim, the little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes, right? He has no response. And maybe that's because he was so worn down by this war, right? Maybe it's like something else. But the fact is, like, the reader is made to do some work. But unlike with Gravity's Rainbow, there's so much fucking, there's a huge payload, right, for this work that you do.
Right.
So that's another like interesting like set of techniques, right? How can we make this character be this kind of like reflection in a sense, right? By making him like a bit inane, by making him the way that he is.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, that's definitely one of the things that I wanted to talk about in the book, right? That's one of the most memorable, and that's the thing, like, you remember this fucking scene. Like, I'll never forget the scene, right?
Yeah.
And you just can't say that for the vast bulk of Gravity's Rainbow. To the extent that you do remember stuff from Gravity's Rainbow, is because it was bad, right? And you're like, what the fuck? Why'd I have to go through this? Um,
Yeah.
what else is there? Well, I mean, do you want to talk about like Billy Pilgrim himself? Like,
Hmm.
like why this type of character for this type of book, as opposed to another type of character, right? He's not heroic, he's not smart, he's not necessarily insightful. To the extent that he does say things that do have some insight, it's because like he allegedly meets these aliens, and he sort of delivers kind of like verbatim what they teach about the world,
Hmm.
and about the universe, and about how things really are, right? And he's like delivering that, right? And of course, this
Yeah.
is probably coming from his own head, right? So maybe he's like insightful in that regard, but it's the irony is like it probably seems to happen because he's kind of like fucked up in some ways. But why Bill Pilgrim, and why this type of person?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a couple of things. Your blank canvas comment from earlier is definitely part of it. We're able to kind of have Billy move about and do whatever that character needs to do to present some of Vonnegut's ideas and move things along. I think there's a couple other levels to it. Maybe one would be by choosing this very kind of bumbling doofus-like character who was extremely reluctant to be part of the war at all, and was completely ineffective and inept during the war,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, one of my other favorite passages is the humorous one fairly early on, where he's basically being carried around as dead weight by Roland Weary and Paul Lazaro. And it's just, they're now being kind of come upon by German soldiers who try to shoot at them. and Billy gets described, and I'll read that in a minute, maybe, as it's just a funny description. Again, to compare it to Pynchon, it's like, it's hilarious and actually a good description of this character. But I think that that's allowing Vonnegut to do some things in terms of showing, like, these are a lot of the people involved in something like a war. It's just a person who is very milquetoast. They're sort of swept by the tides of life. One of those tides for a while happened to be a world war. They were involved in it. They didn't do anything to affect it. They also, or to bring it about, they also didn't do anything really to end it. They just were kind of in it. And then, he goes back to his very humdrum ho-hum life afterward, where like everything's been given to him, right? So he's not particularly driven or capable himself. His father-in-law helped set him up as an optometrist because his father-in-law was the main optometrist in town. And there's all these little ways Vonnegut skewers things like that too, about nepotism or American culture, where it's like, his father is like the best optometrist in Ilium, New York, but no one knows who the best optometrist in Ilium, New York is, right? He just gets to live this like upper middle class posh life, doing nothing, accomplishing nothing other than fixing some people's eyes. And he's just, occasionally he golfs and hacks it around. And I mean, it's just kind of your typical upper middle class life from that standpoint.
And is also like just extremely lucky, right? The fact that he doesn't
Super
die
lucky.
in war, the fact that he becomes rich, the fact that there's this what was it, an airplane crash or was it a helicopter crash, and he's like the sole survivor, right? Just like luck after luck after luck.
Right, and exactly. So to kind of wrap up that point, I was going to say, and so that's it. He's swept along by these tides that are mostly just luck, but it harkens back again. Everything in Vonnegut is more purposeful. It gets used. If the accident will, right? So that phrase from earlier in the book, that's Billy's whole life, is if the accident will. And in his case, the accident does. He's got a nice home. He's got a wife that loves him, even if she's not particularly attractive or whatever. And there's kind of humorous scenes about that. She's not anything to write home about, but she actually does love him. And there's a really funny comment. I don't think I've got the exact page number, but where it talks about how, because Billy has seen all of his future and lived his life many times, he knows that his marriage is going to go well and be at least tolerable all the way through. It's like one of the things he gets to see and envision about his life. So, I think that's it. The last thing I would say is this character who's just able to sort of move along through life with all this luck, and it allows Vonnegut to make commentary on these kind of people as well. Real quick, this description of him I'll just read is from when he's in the war. So this says, last came Billy Pilgrim, bottom of my page 32, empty-handed, bleakly ready for death. Billy was preposterous, 6 feet and 3 inches tall, with a chest and shoulders like a box of kitchen matches. He had no helmet, no overcoat, no weapon, and no boots. On his feet were cheap, low-cut civilian shoes, which he had bought for his father's funeral. Billy had lost a heel, which made him bob up and down, up and down. The involuntary dancing up and down, made his hip joints sore. Billy was wearing a thin field jacket, a shirt and trousers of scratchy wool, and long underwear that was soaked with sweat. He was the only one of the four who had a beard. It was a random, bristly beard, and some of the bristles were white, even though Billy was only 21 years old. He was also going bald. Wind and cold and violent exercise had turned his face crimson. He didn't look like a soldier at all. He looked like a filthy flamingo. So, just actual hilarious and good description of this character at this moment in time, and gives you insight into him and how absurd he is, how ineffectual he is as a soldier.
He like Vonnegut, like he always knows like when to stop, right? He always has like like the right, like in the previous thing we were reading, the women, they touchingly, it was women that did this work, right? It's just like always the right like little word. He definitely has like that huge like Mark Twain strain from him.
Well, and he embodies so well the old Twainism, right? I would have written you a short letter, but I didn't have time, so I wrote you a long one instead.
Yeah.
Right. So in this case, Vonnegut actually took the time to write a nice, short, crisp novel for us, whereas Pynchon didn't have the time, so he wrote a terrible long one instead.
Yeah. There's also this. I decided to highlight this thing, and for me, is page 109 on free will, because free will and determinism are also, subjects that appear in Gravity's Rainbow, and it's like these long ass passages about like debating free will, determinism, blah blah blah, but it's not clever. It doesn't like settle anything, doesn't go anywhere. It's not pithy, it's not memorable, right? Because I mean, like, everybody's always like debating this question, right? Like, I remember Dan and I like had this like long debate back when I had a Facebook, like, years and years ago. And I mean, I don't believe in free will in the way that he does. Although I don't necessarily believe in determinism in the way that's it's typically presented, but anyway, I'm much closer to the determinism side of things. And on page 109, there's this like perfect little encapsulation of this argument and the way that these, beings from outside have settled it. You sound to me as though you don't believe in free will, said Billy Pilgrim. Well, actually, let's just read the whole thing. I mean, the whole thing's good. So, where am I? Said Billy Pilgrim. Trapped in another blob of amber, Mr. Pilgrim. We are where we have to be just now, 300 million miles from Earth, bound for a time warp which will get us to Tralfamadore in hours rather than centuries. How'd I get there? It would take another Earthling to explain it to you. Earthlings are the great explainers, explaining why this event is structured as it is, telling other events may be achieved or avoided. I am a Tralfamadorian, seeing all time as you might see a stretch of the Rocky Mountains. All time is all time. It does not change. It does not lend itself to warnings or explanations. It simply is. Take it moment by moment, and you will find that we are all, as I've said before, bugs in amber. You sound to me as though you don't believe in free will, said Billy Pilgrim. And now, in its own little, like after the ellipsis, it's important enough to be its own little section. This is how the alien responds. If I hadn't spent so much time studying Earthlings, said the Tralfamadorian, I wouldn't have any idea what was meant by free will. I visited 31 inhabited planets in the universe and have studied reports on 100 more. Only on Earth is there any talk of free will, right? And I mean, to me, this is such a perfect like settling of that question, right? Because I mean, it has like everything. Like, first of all, the fact that like I think if you really do think about what is meant by free will, just really like analyze, like, okay, if you believe in free will and this libertarian style of free will, what exactly do you mean? If you try to really, really define it, you'll see like, wow, like I really can't define it in a way that's coherent. I don't know what it means. There's no coherent way to do that. But beyond that, like, in the context of war, in the context of, everything that's happening on the planet, it's like you could look at a moment and say, fuck, like, how did this happen? How did the Holocaust happen? How did, World War II happen? How did Genghis Khan happen? How did this happen? How did that happen? And the answer, of course, is, everything that preceded where we are now, that causal chain, we have led us to this point. That's exactly the argument that I make when I'm arguing about, Hillary Clinton and Trump and all this shit. We have a long causal chain of Democrats behaving as Democrats, where we end with Trump. That is not an accident. People like to like pretend in these like huge like areas of power and history that everything is just like, oh my God, everything is just like by a hair, right? By a thread. And it's fucking not, right? When it comes to history and these like big events, right? Like so much is baked into it. So much, like so many like little links are leading here. You cannot say, we're not responsible. Oops, how did that happen? You can't fucking say oops to Trump, right? There's a long line that leads exactly to that, right? And you better take some fucking responsibility if you want to know the next step, which is, how do you manage to create the next causal links that have a different set of outcomes, right? And they're not like even, like Vonnegut isn't like, beating this point again and again. He's just, this is how he settles this question of free will, right? And I just thought it wonderful, right? And again, in no part in Gravity's Rainbow would this kind of technique be possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Since we're on it, I mean, the beginning of chapter 5, so that ends chapter 4, what you just read there. And this is just more like great stuff. And again, we continue to talk about where Vonnegut does purposeful things early to bring them in later. So here's another good example of that. This is my page 87, beginning of chapter 5. Billy Pilgrim says that the universe does not look like a lot of bright little dots to the creatures from Tralfamadore. The creatures can see where each star has been and where it is going, so that the heavens are filled with rarefied, luminous spaghetti. And Tralfamadorians don't see human beings as two-legged creatures either. They see them as great millipedes, with babies' legs at one end and an old people's legs at the other, says Billy Pilgrim. Billy asked for something to read on the trip to Tralfamadore. His captors had 5 million Earthling books on microfilm, but no way to project them in Billy's cabin. They had only one actual book in English, which would be placed in a Tralfamadorian museum. It was Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Suzanne. Billy read it, thought it was pretty good in spots. The people in it certainly had their ups and downs, but Billy didn't want to read about the same ups and downs over and over again. He asked if there wasn't, please, some other reading matter around. Only Tralfamadorian novels, which I'm afraid you couldn't begin to understand, said the speaker on the wall. Let me look at one anyway. So they sent him in several. They were little things. A dozen of them might have had the bulk of Valley of the Dolls, with all its ups and downs. And this section is still really good from there. But again, so I just read that piece where he's got the one heel as a soldier that fell off, and it makes him go up and down as he walks, and it hurts his hips. And here we are, several pages later, and he's reading about a book with its ups and downs for the characters, but he gets tired of it and doesn't want to keep reading about the exact same ones. Yeah. Again, it's just really, really good little touches all along in there. And this also, the beginning of this chapter makes me think of one other thought about when you asked why Billy Pilgrim and why his character. I think maybe there's also the sense for Vonnegut, this is the section where he goes off on these bigger philosophical concepts for free will and whatever. But obviously by having Billy be who he is, and then out of character making all these pronunciations about how the universe really is or how things really work, no one will listen to him, right? So again, he's not in many ways a Christ-like figure, and Vonnegut does this juxtaposition of them. But he is still meant to be a bit of a prophetic character. He's someone who's trying to tell people things are different than what you perceive them to be, but he's never going to be listened to just because of the type of person that he is. He's no great charismatic figure who can, get some kind of following going or whatever. His kids think he's insane too, and, belittle him a lot and all these other things. So it does set up Vonnegut to allow us to kind of have this moment where there might be some potentially true things, or at least interesting ideas to think about, but they aren't listened to by most people because the delivery system might not be who you expect or what you expect. So Billy's in that way another good. It's a good choice for these kind of things.
And I mean, this section that you read, I have the next page dog-eared, so it gets into a really nice sort of perhaps it's a comment on art, is a comment on artistic possibilities maybe elsewhere. So Billy couldn't reach Tralfamadorian, of course, but he could at least see how the books were laid out in brief clumps of symbols separated by stars. Billy commented on that the clumps might be telegrams. Exactly, said the voice. They are telegrams? There are no telegrams in Tralfamadore. But you're right. Each clump of symbols is a brief, urgent message describing a situation, a scene. We Tralfamadorians read them all at once, not one after the other. There isn't any particular relationship between all the messages, except that the author has chosen them carefully, so that when seen all at once, they produce an image of life that is beautiful and surprising and deep. There is no beginning, no middle, no end, no suspense, no moral, no causes, no effects. What we love in our books are the depths of many marvelous moments seen all at one time. Right. I mean, and this is also kind of like a stand in a little bit for what, he does in Slaughterhouse-Five, right? On Suck in
Mm-hmm.
Time, we're jumping back and forth. And the impression that this book leaves overall, like when you just think about, like you said, like the up and down, Poti weed, and all these other elements, just like when after you finish the book and they stick in your mind, right? This is how it really works, right? So this is it's a bit of an exotic description of an exotic kind of art, but at the same time, it is also very eerily familiar, right? Because a lot of
Mm-hmm.
great art functions somewhat like this at least. So
Yeah. My next bits for Slaughterhouse skip ahead a little bit. It looks like yours do too, because I had some stuff from like the latest 100 pages. Of course, Kilgore Trout is in this book again as a character, features fairly prominently. So he's the sci-fi writer that like not many people ever know about, right? But he's always kind of in Vonnegut's books, living his life, trying to continue writing. And there's humorous scenes toward the end of the book where his books are in a porn shop, and Billy only wants Kilgore
mhm,
Kilgore Trout's books, and the owner's like, no, the good stuff's in the back. That's
mhm,
where you want to be. It's funny, but on my page 170, so Billy is he's like at his wedding anniversary party, I think it is.
mhm.
So Trout's in there. Let's see. Yeah, so this, I mean, it's just a funny scene, and again, it's just some of Vonnegut's a different bit of his humor that I really enjoy. So Billy invited Trout to his 18th wedding anniversary, which was only 2 days hence. Now the party was in progress. Trout was in Billy's dining room, gobbling canapes. He was talking with a mouthful of Philadelphia cream cheese and salmon roe to an optometrist's wife. Everybody at the party was associated with optometry in some way except Trout, and he alone was without glasses. He was making a great hit. Everybody was thrilled to have a real author at the party, even though they had never read his books. Trout was talking to Maggie White, who had given up being a dental assistant to become a homemaker for an optometrist. She was very pretty. The last book she had read was Ivanhoe. Billy Pilgrim stood nearby, listening. He was palpating something in his pocket. It was a present he was about to give his wife, a white satin box containing a star sapphire cocktail ring. The ring was worth $800. The adulation that Trout was receiving, mindless and illiterate as it was, affected Trout like marijuana. He was happy and loud and impudent. I'm afraid I don't read as much as I ought to, said Maggie. We're all afraid of something, Trout replied. I'm afraid of cancer and rats and Doberman pinschers. I should know, but I don't, so I have to ask, said Maggie. What's the most famous thing you ever wrote? It was about a funeral for a great French chef. That sounds interesting. All the great chefs in the world are there. It's a beautiful ceremony. Trout was making this up as he went along. Just before the casket is closed, the mourners sprinkle parsley and paprika on the deceased. So it goes. Did
Mhm.
that really happen? Said Maggie White. She was a dull person, but a sensational invitation to make babies. Men looked at her and wanted to fill her up with babies right away. She hadn't had even one baby yet. She used birth control. Of course it happened, Trout told her. If I wrote something that hadn't really happened and I tried to sell it, I could go to jail. That's fraud. Maggie believed him.
Hmm.
I'd never thought about that before. Think about it now. It's like advertising. You have to tell the truth in advertising or you get in trouble. Exactly. The same body of law applies. Do you think you might put us in a book sometime? I put everything that happens to me in books. I guess I better be careful what I say. That's right. And I'm not the only one who's listening. God is listening too. And on Judgment Day, he's going to tell you all the things you said and did. If it turns out they're bad things instead of good things, that's too bad for you because you burn forever and ever. The burning never stops hurting. Poor Maggie turned gray. She believed that too and was petrified. Kilgore Trout laughed uproariously. A salmon egg flew out of his mouth and landed in Maggie's cleavage.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oh, so I mean, it's just, hilarious dialogue, funny scene. Trout is such a ridiculous person and character, but he's
Yeah.
funny in like every book, that Vonnegut puts him in. So yeah, it just nice. Again, after reading Gravity's Rainbow, it's nice to read this book and like literally be laughing out loud as you're reading
Yeah.
something, you know?
Well, now we got to return to some bitters.
Oh boy. How much more? I don't know how
Uh,
much more I can
I mean,
take.
I feel like we're wrapping up the show in general pretty soon. I just have a couple
Yeah.
things here just to like show some more examples of in the first part, some like bad writing. So section 11, this is page
Mm,
72, has this like sex or like pornographic scene, which is
yeah.
just it's ridiculous. It's like short enough that I could read it, and it's ridiculous enough that it just makes my point.
Yeah.
So we got more of these so-called little microfilms, uh, and there's this like a this there's just like a made-up quote right from Professor Dr. Laszlo Jomf, who did the alleged experiments on Slothrop.
Hmm.
CryptoSam is a proprietary form of stabilized tyrosine developed by IG Farben as part of a research contract with OKW. An activating agent is included, which, in the presence of some component of the seminal fluid to date unidentified, promotes conversion of the tyrosine into melanin or skin pigment. In the absence of seminal fluid, the cryptosome remains invisible. No other known reagent among those available to operatives in the field will alter cryptosome to visible melanin. It is suggested in cryptographic applications that a proper stimulus be included with the message, which will reliably produce tumescence and ejaculation. A thorough knowledge of the addressee's psychosexual profile would seem of invaluable aid. So the reason why we have this is because the shtick now in this part is, so there's this like V2 rocket that lands, and they're trying to figure out some like what is the cryptographic message behind it, and in order to in order to understand what it is, which character is this? Pirate? Yeah, this is Pirate Prentice. Basically, Pirate Prentice is shown some sort of like pornographic film, and he ejaculates, and they use the seminal fluid to crack the code. Again, just this, it's just totally pointless. It's just back to the idea of these are penis. Like if you haven't yet figured out that these are big penises in the sky and men are at fault,
Yeah.
right? Let's just keep fucking hammering you over the head with this shit, because it's certainly not obvious yet. Um, so that's one part. The next part that I want to talk about is, oh yeah, even before like getting to the church, like I just want to like read this like sex scene.
Hmm.
Um, the very first touch, he'd been saying something mean, a bit of the usual Mexico self reproach. You don't know me, I'm really a bastard sort of thing. No, she went to put her fingers on his lips. Don't say that. As she reached without thinking, he grabbed her wrist, moved her hand away, pure defense, but kept holding her by the wrist. They were eyes to eyes, and neither would look away. Roger brought her hand to his lips and kissed it then, still watching her eyes. A pause, his heart in sharp knocks against the front of his chest. Oh, the sound rushing out of her as she came in to hug him, completely let go, open, shivering as they held each other. She told him later that as soon as he took her wrist that night, she came. And the first time he touched her cunt, squeezed Jessica's soft cunt through her knickers, the trembling began again high in her thighs, growing, taking her over. She came twice before cock was ever officially put inside cunt. And this is important to both of them, though neither has figured out why exactly. Right? This is characterization, I assume.
Yeah.
Whatever it happens, though, the light always gets very red for them. Oh, very, wonderful symbolism, right? The use of red, right? It's almost like you're walking through a certain section of or district rather of Amsterdam, right? And you're wondering what kind of color is that?
Yeah.
Um, Once they met at a tea shop, she was wearing a red sweater.
Mm.
With short sleeves, and her bare arms glowed red by her sides. She hadn't any makeup on the first time he'd seen her so. Walking to the car, she takes his hand and puts it for a moment lightly between her moving legs. Roger's heart grows erect and comes. That's really how it feels, up sharply to skin level in a V around his center line, washing over his nipples. It is love. It is amazing. Even when she isn't there after a dream at a face in the street that might against chance by Jessica's, Roger can never control it. He's in its grasp. About Beaver, or Jeremy, as he is known to his mother. So Jeremy is the the fiance of Jessica, right? And Roger Mexico has this like, these like jealous feelings about the fact that she might be getting married. About Beaver or Jeremy,
Mm.
as he is known to his mother, Roger tries not to think any more than he has to. Of course, he agonizes over technical matters. She cannot possibly, can she, be doing the same things, capitalized, with Jeremy? Does Jeremy ever kiss her cunt, for example? Could that prig actually? Does she reach around as they're fucking and slide a mischievous finger, his English rose, into Jeremy's asshole? Stop this. But does she suck his cock? Has he ever had his habitually insolent face between her lovely buttocks? No use. It's youthful folly here, and you're better up off the Tivoli watching Maria Montez and John Hall, or looking for leopards or peccaries in Regent's Park Zoo and wondering if it'll rain before 4:30. I mean, it's just such bad like sex writing, and
Yeah.
it's just bad, right? And the last thing I guess I'll say about Gravity's Rainbow, or rather this section, is near the very end when Jessica, like she starts to basically make this decision, like, all right, well, I have the choice between Jeremy, who is like stable and good, and I have the this other guy, Roger Mexico, who's exciting to me. Who am I going to choose? And she chooses Jeremy. And the way that chapter ends, meaning part one completely, on page 180, the last lines are literally, "Oh Jessica, don't leave me, dot dot dot." Right. So it's like literally like a complete like naked cliche.
Mm-hmm.
Not only is it the end of like a chapter, it's the end of like the first section, right? And I mean, like, look, like if you're writing, you really have to take care that the beginnings are good, the endings are good, right? If there's important sections like this, like you have to make sure that they work. And this is just kind of throwaway. And like, to be fair, there's a little bit there's something a little bit better here, but it doesn't really go anywhere. Like when she makes this decision to like leave Roger, she says, "Oh, super duper," she says, "I think I'm catching a cold." And he thinks to himself, "You're catching the war. It's infecting you, and I don't know how to keep it away. Oh, Jessica, don't leave me." Right. So there's like the hints of like something that might be good that's starting, but instead, this is the one place that he chooses to be like very like short, right? Very terse in his writing that
Mm-hmm.
needs actual, some actual like development of the insight, and then he just finishes it on a cliche. I mean, it's just very silly stuff. I guess the last thing I'll say about the book is at the very ending when Gottfried is in the rocket. One thing that I do appreciate about it, not in terms of the writing, but just in terms of what the decisions that Pynchon made leading to it, is we have this like rocket that's like in multiple stages, like it's taking off, now it's in the air, now it's making its descent, right? And you have the sections are split up in this way. um and so this like 00000 rocket, uh there's no like moralizing about it. There's no like, oh my god, and there was this all this mass destruction, there was this, there was that. There's really nothing like that. And I think there's a poetry to be able to simply have something that is, it's destruction, right? There's something sinister about it, but you don't offer that kind of commentary. You let it, in a sense, speak for itself. Now, the problem in the book is that as it speaks for itself, it doesn't say anything,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's no, if you're doing something like this, there needs to be like implications, right? Even if you're doing the whole, Keatsian negative capability thing, there needs to be some kind of surroundings, right, to make it all coherent. There's none of that, but that instinct that he had was the right instinct, right? Let's not moralize about this thing. Like, let's treat it differently. It's just that in his hands, it's just not capable, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I mean that's really about it. I feel like we've read enough of this book, uh, that it doesn't really matter to even go through those ending passages. So I guess we could finish on Slaughterhouse-Five, unless you have like something else to say about Gravity's Rainbow or whatever.
Not really. The only other thing I was going to highlight is once again, just these little tricks that Pynchon tries to employ that are so pointless. So I think I had said this in my notes to you, where for the character of Osby Feel, I think eventually other characters at the same thing gets employed, but like on page 108, he says "ah" in response to something a Pirate Prentice says, and it's spelled S-E-Z for says instead of S-A-Y-S.
Yeah, he starts doing that randomly at some point, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
just like
it just starts happening. Before it always says S-A-Y-S,
yeah,
and then just without warning, without reason.
that's why I highlighted, because that's the first place I saw it. Maybe it happened before that, but that's the first place I saw it. It comes out of nowhere. And it's just one of those things you're like, what are you trying to accomplish? Along with all the other errors here that we've pointed out, but it literally reads like trolling from a creative writing class exercise to me. It's just so stupid and pointless. So no, I didn't have anything else to say. I don't care if anyone comes after me because I didn't finish the book. When something doesn't earn your attention, you don't have to provide it. So probably the least enjoyable experience I've certainly had in recent memory, maybe all time, trying to read a book.
Definitely for this show, right? Definitely for this show.
For sure. Yeah. I really can't pull anything good out of it, and certainly not anything good that other authors and books don't accomplish in spades or in much stronger ways on their own. So this book doesn't need to be in existence, and it's about the worst condemnation you could give to it, I suppose. There's just no need for it, other than as a parallax with other good stuff.
The odd thing is like, how when we think about like really great writers, like you could take Herman Melville out of the equation, right? Like he could have like literally never existed, and there wouldn't have been anyone to take his place, right? There would have been no Moby Dick like thing with all the techniques that it employs. Like we don't even have to talk about like the same subject matter. Like it doesn't have to be the same book, but in general, like speaking of like the techniques, the kinds of language that he uses, just like the artistry in general. You take Herman Melville out of the equation, and there's no second Moby Dick, like, because there's no book that you could point to, because at the time it wasn't a book that was well known, with the exception of, at the time there were like some famous people, like it was it was Emerson. It was Emerson that was really a fan of Moby Dick, right? And he wrote like approvingly of it. He wrote letters to Melville about it. And I think also it was Nathaniel Hawthorne who was really into the book as well. But beyond that, right, it's just, it didn't have a real effect on culture. And it was only, he died. It was already like out of print for like 10 or 20 years, along with like most of his other books. And it was only sort of found again in the 20s and 30s, right, of the last century. So it's only been about a century that it's really been in the public consciousness. Yeah. So there would have been no replacement for it. But it does feel like to me that Tom, like if it wasn't for Pynchon, there would have been somebody that just like wanted to just like fuck around, be lazy, essentially, pretend that they're hardworking while being lazy. Because that's such a human sort of impulse, right? Like to want to get all the sort of, plaudits of doing something worthwhile without actually doing it. So just like, pulling the wool over somebody's eyes, like there could be, millions of Pynchons out there. And the fact that he did this kind of shit first means that, if somebody at the time sort of was thinking, dude, they're like, fuck, like they wouldn't think this consciously, but the idea would be like, he ran that scam first, right? We can't do that now. But of course, later on, like people like, David Foster Wallace and others, they sort of do something similar. But that takes like a little time, a little distance, right? So that you couldn't be accused of just like openly ripping somebody off. that's the thing. Like it's kind of it's an interesting sort of thought experiment. Like there would have been a Pynchon, right? It would have come along simply because he's a product of these these like lesser human drives, whereas like Melville is a product of like the highest human drives that there's no compensation there, right? No one's gonna pat you on the back of the head for doing Moby Dick back then. Instead, you're gonna get punished for it. Here it's the opposite, right? So all the incentives are for someone like a Pynchon to come out of the swamp, right? Essentially.
Yeah. Do you want to move toward the end of Slaughterhouse and maybe talk about the final chapter and how he wraps up?
Well, I have just on my page 213. The last like quote that I really wanted to talk about was when Trout is talking about his books, and this one book that he wrote. And then the newspaper girl held up her hand. This is like when he was like doing this like newspaper scam. And then the newspaper girl held up her hand. "Mr. Trout," she said, "if I win, can I take my sister too?" "Hell no," said Kilgore Trout. "You think money grows on trees?" And there's an ellipsis and there's a tiny little paragraph like this. Trout, incidentally, had written a book about a money tree. It had $20 bills for leaves. Its flowers were government bonds. Its fruit was diamonds. It attracted human beings who killed each other around the roots and made very good fertilizer. So it goes. Again, nothing else. I mean, what else do you need to say about money, right? This is exactly what it is, right? This is exactly what it's incentivized to do. And this is exactly how human beings respond to money, right? It's like the end of story. So I mean, if you want to tackle, I've been talking for a while, if you want to tackle the ending or whatever else, maybe you should just do that and wrap this up.
Well, so I did want to call out, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, the funny scene in the adult entertainment store where Billy's in there and he's he's taken by the Kilgore Trout novels. So this is my page 201. It says, "But Billy Pilgrim wasn't beguiled by the back of the store. He was thrilled by the Kilgore Trout novels in the front. The titles were all new to him, or he thought they were. Now he opened one. It seemed all right for him to do that. Everybody else in the store was pawing things. The name of the book was The Big Board. He got a few paragraphs into it, and then he realized that he had read it before, years ago in the Veterans Hospital. It was about an earthling man and woman who were kidnapped by extraterrestrials. They were put on display in a zoo on a planet called Zircon 212. These fictitious people in the zoo had a big board, supposedly showing stock market quotations and commodity prices along one wall of their habitat, and a news ticker and a telephone that was supposedly connected to a brokerage on Earth. The creatures on Zircon 212 told their captives that they had invested $1 million for them back on Earth, and that it was up to the captives to manage it so that they would be fabulously wealthy when they were returned to Earth. The telephone and the big board and the ticker were all fakes, of course. They were simply stimulants to make the Earthlings perform vividly for the crowds at the zoo, to make them jump up and down and cheer or gloat or sulk or tear their hair, to be scared shitless or to feel as contented as babies in their mother's arms. The Earthlings did very well on paper. That was part of the rigging, of course, and religion got mixed up in it too. The news ticker reminded them that the President of the United States had declared National Prayer Week and that everybody should pray. The Earthlings had had a bad week on the market before that. They had lost a small fortune in olive oil futures. So they gave praying a whirl. It worked. Olive oil went up. Another Kilgore Trout book there in the window was about a man who built a time machine so he could go back and see Jesus. It worked, and he saw Jesus when Jesus was only 12 years old. Jesus was learning the carpentry trade from his father. 2 Roman soldiers came into the shop with a mechanical drawing on papyrus of a device they wanted built by sunrise the next morning. It was a cross to be used in the execution of a rabble-rouser. Jesus and his father built it. They were glad to have the work, and the rabble-rouser was executed on it. So it goes. Yeah. So, I mean, again, just by this kind of like book within a book, right? This is Kilgore Trout's novels. These are his books that Billy's finding and kind of reading through briefly, but allowing Vonnegut another avenue by which to make these commentaries on the way the world works. And again, as always, just leaves it right at the right time, gives you that kernel, lets you run with it from there, and kind of have the pleasure of unpackaging the treat. But anyway, yeah, I mean, so moving through the final chapter, we get to one of only a couple, let's see. He's got a couple drawings in this book, but not many. But let's see. Yeah, so this is, I mean, toward the very end, Billy Pilgrim traveling back to Dresden too, not in the present, going there 2 days after the city was destroyed, so on. So there's digging for bodies, right? To dig holes in the ground. This is where Billy goes back in time to Dresden, and he gets commissioned along with a lot of other people to dig holes for the bodies. And so the kind of the famous ending, which I can read, and then we can just talk about this last use of the detail. There were hundreds of corpse mines operating by and by. They didn't smell bad at first, were wax museums, but then the bodies rotted and liquefied, and the stink was like roses and mustard gas. So it goes. Again, another thing popping up in a different context from earlier. The Maori Billy had worked with died of the dry heaves after having been ordered to go down in that stink and work. He tore himself to pieces, throwing up and throwing up. So it goes. So a new technique was devised. Bodies weren't brought up anymore. They were cremated by soldiers with flamethrowers right where they were. The soldiers stood outside the shelters, simply sent the fire in. Somewhere in there, the poor old high school teacher, Edgar Derby, was caught with a teapot he had taken from the catacombs. He was arrested for plundering. He was tried and shot. So it goes. And somewhere in there was springtime. Great change right there, right? Great, great change. The corpse mines were closed down. The soldiers all left to fight the Russians. In the suburbs, the women and children dug rifle pits. Billy and the rest of his group were locked up in the stable in the suburbs. And then one morning, they got up to discover that the door was unlocked. World War II in Europe was over. Billy and the rest wandered out onto the shady street. The trees were leafing out. There was nothing going on out there, no traffic of any kind. There was only one vehicle, an abandoned wagon drawn by 2 horses. The wagon was green and coffin-shaped. Birds were talking. One bird said to Billy Pilgrim, "Pooty wee?" That's the end. So just as Vonnegut told us he would, he ends it with Pooty wee. But yeah, what do you make of the ending of the novel there?
I mean, like another like wonderful like little negative capability jump, right? We have like all these like memories, right, floating through all these little events. And somewhere in there was like, where, right? We're talking about memory, we're talking about history, right? There's it's kind of like abstracted away, and yet there's also enough of the tangible that really kind of like sticks with you. And of course, like, at the end of it, right, he did ask originally, what do you say about a massacre? What do you say about war? Right. Pody Weed is essentially it, right? It's kind of in that way the perfect ending. Right. He said it was going to happen. And that's the thing, like, it's back to this idea of like free will, determinism, and all this other stuff. He said it was going to happen a certain way. It does happen this way. And artists, of course, are the ones that control these worlds best of all, right? You're not going to be able to control the war. You're not going to be able to control these outside events, but internally, this is, like essentially, like, this is the war. Like, this is how so much of war will be remembered, right? Mm-hmm. It's books like this, right?
Yeah, well, and it's a good, his prediction, so to speak, at the end of chapter 1, where he tells you how the book is going to start and end once he really starts it, is also an echo of this whole passage we read earlier with the free will versus determinism. The way that time is treated by Tralfamadorians as looking at a stretch of the Rocky Mountains, right? And as an author, as an artist, for your world, that is how you're looking at it, right? Yeah. You're able to see the whole thing from start to finish. You know what it's going to look like. Your characters don't. You move them about, and they're, they, in that sense, they're kind of like we are, here as real people. But he's in control of all of that, and the interesting thing is that by the time that you get to the end of the book and then you read that last section and you read the Putti Wheat, you kind of get this like wry smile on your face, like, yeah, okay, he almost kind of got me. You remember all over again that he told you at the beginning this is how he was going to end it, and then he starts it how he said he would, he ends it how he said he would. But yeah, just a magnificent book. I think we've said before on some other shows about Vonnegut that we were in agreement this was his best novel. I know Dan thinks that same thing. And I
would probably say Cat's Cradle is maybe I would say that this book is better, but it's hard for me to like to put Cat's Cradle also too far away from this one.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, he's obviously one of the best writers that we've had. So yeah, you have to love how unique his style is, how it comes through so clearly and so densely in this book. I think I said to you in my notes that keep in mind there's a lot of the same technique employed in here that Pynchon does in Gravity's Rainbow. It's very vignette style, right? I mean, you get transported to all these different places and times. You're kind of told how that's going to happen and why that's happening because of Billy, but it's a similar type of approach, but it's sketchy and things are just given to you at the most essential and then left alone. But for that reason, it does have this poetic nature to it, and it does feel very dense and rich and like a treat to read it, and keep discovering the book all over again. It's very much like a great and favorite film would be in that same manner, right? I don't tire of it really. I get a kick out of it every time I've read it. So
yeah. Well, I mean, this is a nice place to end things. The next month in June, me and Dan are going to record a show on Elon Musk.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe we could get some input from you as well. Maybe some notes. But yeah. But thank you guys for watching. You could hit like, hit subscribe. And we will see you very, very soon.
Oh my god.